Chapter 1863. It's really convenient. Luo Fan could only sigh in admiration. He could not help but admire the ability to directly eliminate the repulsive force of the entire higher spacetime dimension. Moreover, it was performed by Supreme Emotion. I just don't want you to use this as an excuse if you lose, Supreme Emotion said with a smile. As he spoke, his figure flashed and appeared in front of Luo Fan in an instant. He threw a punch straight at Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt as if the entire higher spacetime dimension was being held in his opponent's hand and was crushing him. This feeling was so obvious that he instantly knew that this punch from Supreme Emotion would be terrifying beyond imagination. It was even more terrifying than the attack that he had used the Divine Court's heavenly cauldron to transfer to the outside of the higher spacetime dimension and easily erased. As expected of a Supreme. At this time, Luo Fan secretly praised in his heart. However, he naturally did not think that he was inferior to his opponent. At this moment, he also threw a punch and met his opponent's punch without hesitation. Supreme Emotion's punch seemed to have condensed all the power of the entire higher spacetime dimension, and its destructive power was normally enough to completely erase everything about Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan's punch was equally terrifying. However, he had made use of the fact that he was not in this high-dimensional space. In an instant, he had already turned the terrifying power from his opponent's fist into countless strands and easily moved them out of this high-dimensional space. In the end, the power that had truly landed on his fist was not even 100 trillionth of the original power, although even 1 billionth of the power was enough to completely destroy any heaven and earth. However, this level of power could not cause real harm to Luo Fan at all. With a tremble of his power, that 1 billionth of the power was dispersed by him. As it scattered in all directions, it crushed the surrounding infinite space-time dimension into powder. Of course, Wu Miao and Qing Longzi were still protected by Luo Fan's power, so they were not affected much and were still calmly watching everything in front of them. Supreme Emotion obviously did not think that his punch could easily get rid of Luo Fan. Therefore, he wasn't surprised that his punch was deflected by Luo Fan. His movements didn't even slow down in the slightest as he punched out once again. This punch was different from the previous one. There was a subtle adjustment in the power compared to before. The punch seemed to connect all spacetime dimensions, heaven and earth, the universe, and even the state of chaos. It produced a strange gray mist that seemed to turn everything into chaos. It was wrapped by the punch. Crazily, he charged towards Luo Fan. This was obviously the result of Supreme Emotion adjusting his fist according to the situation of Luo Fan's punch just now. If Luo Fan were to use that kind of attack again, he would definitely lose his life. At this moment, it would be difficult for him to block Supreme Dark Devil's fist. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan naturally would not be polite. With a thought, he also threw a punch. However, his strength was also slightly adjusted compared to before. It was also adjusted according to the strength of the opponent's fist. Once again, he deflected the opponent's power. He easily blocked such a punch. At this time, Supreme Emotion finally let out a cry of approval. At that moment, he punched again. At the same time, this fist was also adjusted compared to before. Just like that, the two of them punched each other again and again in the space-time dimension, as if two barbarians were fighting. It didn't seem to have any technical content, and it didn't seem like a battle between cultivators at all, let alone a battle between supreme-level existences. However, the truth was that every single punch from the two of them contained endless principles and endless mysteries. If taken out, even a trace of it would be enough to allow any living being to cultivate from zero to the false saint realm, or even the supreme emperor realm. As they clashed, the space-time dimension around them was completely shattered. In fact, Even the absolute nothingness behind the time dimension had been completely shattered by their power, revealing a strange barrier. Through this barrier, they could see the gray and hazy state of chaos. As for Wamiao and Qinglongzi, they had already been sent out by Luo Fan. The range of their battle had already appeared millions of miles away. At this moment, the two of them still had Luo Fan's power on them. It could still protect them from any external forces, and it could still withstand all impacts from the outside world. However, the place where they were was already extremely safe. The 11 supreme beings around them naturally saw Luo Fan's actions. However, none of them paid any attention to it, as if they didn't notice it at all. For supreme beings who had the status of true saints in this high space-time dimension, other than supreme-level existences, everything else was just like ant. Luo Fan's behavior, in their opinion, was like sweeping away a few ants at his feet before a battle. How could he possibly do anything else? After being sent out, Wamiao and Qinglongzi took a long time to realize that the place they were in had changed. In front of them, the place that was originally a boundless sea of clouds had now completely surpassed their perception, as if it didn't exist at all. Around them, they could occasionally hear loud rumbling sound. Apart from that, there were no other changes. At a glance, there was still a sea of clouds in front of them. However, it was the sea of clouds that was billions of miles away previously. If one were to look carefully, they would realize that somewhere in the center, the sea of clouds that was originally billions of miles away had already been connected. Now it was already connected. It was as if the region that was billions of miles away in the middle had completely disappeared from the space-time dimension. We don't even have the right to watch the battle. Wamiao sighed, and there was an inexplicable sense of loss on her face. Insufficient strength, that's all. At this moment, Qinglongzi was much more at ease compared to Wamiao. After all, she was a disciple of a true saint. Although he had not seen many battles between true sages, with his understanding of true sages, he knew how terrifying a battle between true sages would be. Although those supreme beings and Luo Fan weren't considered true saints, due to their special status in this high space-time dimension, they were almost on par with true saints. In fact, they were almost on the same level as a true sage. Hence, the battle between them could be considered as a battle between true sages. However, the two of them didn't have the right to watch such a battle. That was to be expected. In fact, Qinglongzi was already very surprised that she had been able to watch for such a long time. She was extremely grateful to Luo Fan. I wonder if he can defeat Supreme Being Mo Xian, Wamiao said. Victory? A look of hesitation appeared on Qinglongzi's face. She didn't doubt Luo Fan's ability, but she didn't have much hope that he could defeat Supreme Being Mo Xian. There was no other reason. It was because his opponent was Supreme Being Mo Xian, who was equivalent to a true saint in this high space-time dimension. Wamiao looked at Qinglongzi and wanted to get an answer from her, who had a better understanding of true saints. Unfortunately, Qinglongzi didn't give her an answer in the end. Wamiao couldn't help but be disappointed by this situation. Wamiao and Qinglongzi were in a dilemma outside. Let's not talk about them. At this moment, on the battlefield, the battle between Luo Fan and Supreme Being Mo Xian had already reached its climax. The two of them were still throwing punches at each other. Furthermore, every single punch from the two of them contained an inexhaustible amount of principles, boundless mysteries. In the beginning, their punches were completely destructive. They were just attacks. However, as time passed, they continuously adjusted according to the other party. The power unleashed by the fist gradually changed, gradually giving rise to the charm of creation. World after world appeared in their surroundings, gradually evolving into all sorts of indescribable light and shadows, developing into all sorts of civilizations that even the surrounding Supreme's eyes lit up when they saw them. However, these worlds and civilizations couldn't last long. Very soon, it was torn apart and destroyed in the battle between the two sides, giving birth to even more wondrous and perfect worlds, giving birth to even more unbelievable civilizations. 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, 10 million times, 100 million times. Time and time again, the cultivation paths of Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion gradually evolved and displayed their comprehension. Gradually, they started to communicate in this extremely mysterious way. This allowed both Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion to have a deeper understanding of each other's cultivation path. As this understanding and comprehension appeared, the two of them gradually forgot about the battle and the outcome of the battle. Instead, they devoted themselves to this kind of communication. As the cycle of creation and destruction continued to increase, the surrounding worlds gradually turned into space-time dimensions. It wasn't the small and empty space-time dimensions of the higher space-time dimensions. Instead, it was the complete space-time dimensions of the lower space-time dimensions. It was the perfect space-time dimensions of countless worlds and space-time dimensions. The various space-time dimensions were even more abundant than the world. The cultivation paths displayed within them were even more perfect, and their communication deepened. An indescribable comprehension gradually appeared in the eyes of the two of them. At that moment, the 10 surrounding Supreme Beings all had a look of realization on their faces. Vaguely, they also began to comprehend something. Finally, one of the Supreme Beings couldn't help but make a move. He let out a soft cry. "My hands are also itching. Fellow Taoists, you too wouldn't mind if I participate, right?" As he spoke, he didn't even wait for Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion to reply. He immediately attacked them. Using his physical body to attack was a unique characteristic of Supreme Being Emotion. The original fighting style of the other Supreme Beings wasn't the same. However, this time, this Supreme Being clearly wasn't fighting for the sake of fighting. Instead, he was fighting to participate in the discussion between Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion. Therefore, he naturally didn't use his strongest fighting method. Instead, he used the same fighting method that Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion had used. He used his fists and joined in. His actions woke the other Supreme Beings up from a dream, and they all pretended to say something. They directly joined the battle. Of course, their battle wasn't to besiege Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion. Instead, each of them was fighting against the other. In other words, it was an extremely chaotic battle. Any two Supreme Beings were opponents, and there was a battle between them. This caused the already intense battle to suddenly become much more chaotic. An indescribable order, but also a chaotic battle scene that resembled the state of chaos appeared, this battle scene. At first, Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion occupied the absolute majority and easily crushed the other Supreme Beings, causing the other Supreme Beings to involuntarily join forces to resist them. After all, Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion had been fighting for such a long time. Although they had gradually forgotten about the battle and the outcome of the battle, they were still relying on their own mystical abilities and their own strength to evolve. This had already pushed their fighting strength to an unbelievable level. In comparison, the other Supreme Beings had just joined in and weren't using their strongest fighting methods. It was natural for them to fall into a disadvantageous position. Everyone joined forces to fight against Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion, forming a certain balance that allowed the battle to enter a stalemate. As the battle progressed, the fighting methods of the other 10 Supreme Beings gradually improved. Their fighting capabilities gradually strengthened, and eventually, the balance was naturally broken again. This also caused the other Supreme Beings to gradually split up, and the 10 Supreme Beings also began to fight amongst themselves. Finally, they no longer joined forces to deal with Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion. Gradually, a new balance was formed, a balance that was constantly changing amidst the chaos. This chaos was many times more complicated than the battle between Luo Fan and Supreme Being Emotion. The changes in the situation were also much faster. In order to maintain their own safety in this kind of battle, Luo Fan and the others had no choice but to advance the evolution of their own power even faster, to adjust their own power even faster, to have a deeper understanding of the various attacks they had encountered, and to have no choice but to more clearly display their own cultivation paths. This was what all the Supreme Beings wanted. For a time, more and more space-time dimensions were born and destroyed in this area. All kinds of cultivation paths were constantly colliding and influencing each other. Finally, at a certain moment several hundred years after the start of the battle, the attacking forces of all 11 Supreme Beings and Luo Fan finally resonated in an indescribable manner. This kind of resonance was mysterious and wonderful. In an instant it converged in one place, producing an indescribable effect. It caused the energy that should have been extremely chaotic and produced billions of space-time dimensions to converge in one place, finally opening up a single space-time dimension. A complete space-time dimension that encompassed all of their paths of cultivation and had evolved into billions of different civilizations. This space-time dimension was similar to the higher space-time dimension. It was much higher than the lower space-time dimension, but it was slightly inferior to the higher space-time dimension. To be more specific, this mixed space-time dimension was more like the space-time dimension in the abyss that Luo Fan had stepped into. It was also like the space-time portal with the abstract door that he had entered before stepping into this higher space-time dimension. Below this space-time dimension, there were countless space-time dimensions densely packed together. In each of those lower space-time dimensions, there were countless worlds and space-time densely packed together. Among them, an unknown number of living beings evolved and gradually formed an unknown number of civilizations. At this moment, Luo Fan and the 11 Supreme Beings all sensed this abnormal change. All of them suddenly stopped and no longer continued the extremely chaotic and tragic battle from before. From the extreme movement just now to the extreme stillness now, the entire process was so straightforward and decisive that it exceeded the imagination of all living beings. Moreover, the tacit understanding between them was so great that ordinary cultivators could not understand it. At this moment, all of them realized how rare it was for this space-time dimension to appear. They also understood that they no longer needed to fight. The space-time dimension in front of them could already naturally evolve all of their paths of cultivation. It was enough for them to discuss the path of cultivation. Immediately, everyone looked at each other and smiled. One by one, they slowly closed their eyes. In the blink of an eye, thoughts and clones emerged from their bodies and entered the strange space-time dimension. They scattered into the many lower space-time dimensions and entered the different parts of the world and the different space-time dimensions. Just the number of clones that Luo Fan had sent into it alone was hundreds of billions. The number of protection, thoughts that the other 11 Supreme Beings had sent into it would only be more than his, not less. From this, it could be seen just how many clones had entered these space-time dimensions at this time. However, even though there were so many clones, so many thoughts, they were still so insignificant compared to this strange space-time dimension. In fact, all the clones, thoughts that had scattered into all the worlds and all the lower space-time dimensions were not even 1/10,000th of all the lower space-time dimensions as a whole. Chapter 1864. Those clones, thoughts entered a certain lower space-time dimension and landed in a certain world. They turned around and turned into living beings within that world. They began to cultivate, grow, pursue the great Tao of the world, seek the truth of the world, and search for the cultivation path hidden behind that world. Then, through this method, they broke through the world and the space-time dimension. During this process, they comprehended the true essence of the cultivation path of the cultivators in the space-time dimension that was connected to the world and experienced the indescribable mysteries contained within. This did not only happen to Luo Fan, but also to the other Supremes. For all of them, every clone, every thought contained their complete will and almost everything about them. In this way, their cultivation speed was extremely fast. No matter where they went, no matter where they went, no matter where they went, they wouldn't be able to hold them for too long. No matter how complicated or high-level the world was, it would take them at most 100 years to break through. Once they broke through that world and the space-time dimension, they would naturally step into another world and another space-time dimension and repeat the process that they had gone through once or several times before. Just like that, the breakthroughs in the world and space-time dimension caused each of the 12 of them to gradually gain a deeper understanding of the cultivation path of the others. Their cultivation realm also began to improve again and again during this process. Among them, the benefits were the greatest for Luo Fan, those Supremes. Each of them had their own cultivation path, and each of them had reached the end of their cultivation path. Otherwise, they would not have become Supremes. They would not have become supreme existences like true saints in this higher space-time dimension. In this way, their implementation of their own cultivation path and understanding of their own cultivation path would naturally have its merit. For Luo Fan, all of this was a fundamental stimulation to his worldview again and again. Every time Luo Fan endured this stimulation, it was equivalent to a transformation and a leap in his worldview. Every time Luo Fan endured this kind of stimulation, it was equivalent to a transformation. It was equivalent to a leap in his worldview. And so on. Again and again, again and again. Unknowingly, his view of the world had transformed to an indescribable level. Almost every time he came back to his senses, he could faintly feel that the third great calamity seemed to have arrived a lot earlier. It should be pointed out that the third great calamity seemed to have arrived a lot earlier. The time it took for the calamity to descend decreased as his cultivation level increased. Every time he sensed the arrival of a great tribulation, it naturally meant that his cultivation realm had risen again and again. 380 million years from the very beginning. The last time he came back to his senses, it had been less than 300 million years. That was a total of 80 million years of time. It went without saying how great this improvement was. However, only close to 10,000 years had passed since he and the 11 Supremes fell into this kind of communication. Moreover, at this time, his incarnation, his thoughts have done that day on Earth. The space-time dimension only occupied less than 1% of the numerous world. Every time Luo Fan thought about this, he felt an inexplicable sense of fullness in his heart. Just when Luo Fan thought that this kind of discussion would continue until he could no longer gain anything, there was an inexplicable change in the situation. On this particular day, he suddenly heard a strange sound. The voice was faintly discernible, but it contained an indescribable attraction. It was as if it was calling him, making him follow the voice to a mysterious direction. This situation instantly made Luo Fan wake up with a start, and a vigilant look appeared on his face. He was not an ordinary living being, nor was he an ordinary cultivator. For him now, as long as he was unwilling, even if a true divine wanted to call him away, he would still have the ability to resist. However, how could he leave because of this unreasonable call? When he came back to his senses, he realized that in this area, which was the space-time dimension between the higher space-time dimension and the lower space-time dimension, the other 11 Supremes had also come back to their senses and were all vigilant. Evidently, their encounter was similar to that of Luo Fan. This is a call from outside the higher space-time dimension. At this moment, Supreme Demon Xian frowned and made a judgment. His judgment was similar to that of Luo Fan. However, he felt that this call came from the state of chaos. "Who is it?" a supreme martial artist asked softly. This soft shout seemed to contain infinite power, as it directly penetrated this space-time dimension and even the higher space-time dimension, directly blasting into the absolute nothingness outside the higher space-time dimension. Outside the higher space-time dimension was not the state of chaos, but there was still a layer of nothingness. a layer of nothingness that was beyond the imagination of all living beings, and even beyond the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. After this layer of nothingness there was only the state of chaos. At this moment, the call that rang out in everyone's ears gradually weakened, and in a short while, it became invisible, as if it had never appeared in the first place. The way it disappeared was almost exactly the same as the way it appeared. It was also inexplicable and extremely strange. With this interlude, the various Supremes no longer had the mood to discuss Tao. They all sighed, and with a sway of their bodies, they had already dispersed the power of the space-time dimension that they had been maintaining all this while. Following the actions of these Supremes, the strange space-time dimension between the higher space-time dimension and the lower space-time dimension that had existed for tens of thousands of years started to gradually dissipate. In a short while, it became invisible, causing this area to once again turn into absolute nothingness. At this moment, the call that rang out in everyone's ears suddenly became several times stronger. Under this call, a passageway actually appeared in front of everyone. This passageway was so strange. It seemed like a real passageway, yet it also seemed like an absolute illusion, as if it did not exist at all. Even though it had already appeared in front of everyone, and everyone could already see this passageway with their eyes. However, they could not sense the existence of this passageway at all. It was as if this passageway was just a collective illusion that they had created, and it did not exist at all. Such a situation was not only for Luo Fan, but also for these Supremes. It was an unbelievable change. In an instant, everyone's expressions changed slightly, and their eyes revealed a strong sense of vigilance. It's actually a passageway that came from the state of chaos. Luo Fan looked at this passageway, and an indescribable impulse suddenly welled up in his heart. With a jolt of his heart, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already arrived at the entrance of this passageway, and he looked into the passageway. To Luo Fan, everything in this higher space-time dimension was in existence that provided him with cultivation resources. He did not have any deep feelings for this place. To him, leaving this higher space-time dimension was not an impossible choice, and he did not even need to make any sacrifices. Therefore, if he could feel that what was behind this passageway could be beneficial to his cultivation, he would definitely not have the slightest bit of hesitation to step into it. In contrast, it was obviously impossible for the other Supremes to do so. To the other Supremes, this higher space-time dimension was their home, their foundation, and the foundation of their existence. Once they lost this higher space-time dimension, and even if they left this higher space-time dimension, they would be beaten down to the mundane world, and would no longer be Supremes. They would no longer be omnipotent and omniscient. Omniscient? How could they accept this? Therefore, to them, no matter what world was behind this passageway, no matter whether it was beneficial to their cultivation, they would never choose to step into it. It was precisely because of this difference that at this time, the other Supremes were more wary of this passageway, and there was more rejection in their eyes. There was not the slightest bit of curiosity and exploration like Luo Fan. At this time, when they saw Luo Fan's actions, all of their expressions changed slightly. After a while, Supreme Emo Xian, who had fought with Luo Fan, said, "This passageway seems to be connected to another world. If you step into it, I'm afraid that you will never be able to return." Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "It doesn't matter to me where I cultivate. If stepping into it can give me a chance to become a true sage, I will definitely not hesitate." There was not the slightest bit of hesitation in his words. Without the slightest bit of hesitation, he vividly displayed the determination in his heart, which made the 11 Supremes in front of him feel like they had never felt before. At this time, the passageway trembled slightly, and it looked like it was about to collapse. As a result, the summoning became even more mournful, and there was a faint, indescribable despair coming from it. that kind of mournfulness, that kind of despair, even urged Luo Fan's mind, causing his impulse to step into it to become even stronger. Just what kind of summoning could actually produce such an effect? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Afterwards, he made a prompt decision. With a thought, an incarnation was instantly created from his body, and it directly stepped into the passageway. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared from the area. At this moment, the passageway seemed to finally be unable to withstand it. After a slight tremble, it gradually dissipated, as if it had never existed in the first place. At this time, the Supremes all let out a long sigh and said, "What's the point of doing this? Once the incarnation steps into it, it will be equivalent to gaining independence. I'm afraid that you won't be able to sense any changes in it, right?" What they said was common sense. After all, based on their senses, behind the passageway should be a world in a state of chaos. This kind of world was separated from the higher space-time dimension in a state of chaos, and the space-time between them was completely independent. There was almost no connection between the two. Under such circumstances, apart from the mysterious spiritual connection, if the incarnation were to enter it, all other connections would be cut off. When that happened, the incarnation would, of course, gain independence. At that time, the avatar would naturally gain independence. However, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Perhaps." However, he didn't explain too much. Just as everyone had said, if an ordinary person's incarnation was sent into another world in a state of chaos, it was highly likely that such a situation would occur. But this was different from the current situation. It wasn't just because he had formed his own unique space-time dimension. The connection between his avatar and his main body had become unprecedentedly close. Even in the primal chaos state, it was difficult to completely cut it off. More importantly, the fact that some sort of summoning could be transmitted here meant that the place behind the passageway was connected to the higher space-time dimension. It wasn't as absolute as two perfect worlds. In the end, the connection between the main body and the incarnation couldn't really be cut off, and the facts proved his conjecture. Even now, he could still clearly sense everything that was happening to his clone. It was as if he was there himself, and he could see what the clone looked like when it crossed the mysterious passage. The 11 Supremes sighed and didn't have any interest in staying here any longer. One by one, they bid farewell to Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, they left. After the Supremes left, the area that was originally separated began to merge back into the higher space-time dimension. Even the destruction caused by their battle began to recover. The entire process seemed to be going back in time. In just a short while, the place had completely returned to the scene before the battle. Everything looked as if nothing had happened. At the same time, Wen Miao and Qing Longzi, who were cultivating outside the area, suddenly realized that the space-time dimension in front of them had suddenly opened up. The sea of clouds that had originally disappeared suddenly spread out again. It appeared in front of them. The mountain peak that they had opened up their cave abodes in previously also appeared in the middle of this sea of clouds. For a moment, they couldn't believe their eyes. It took them a while to react. One by one, they moved quickly. In just a short while, they all arrived at the mountain peak and saw Luo Fan standing there. When they saw Luo Fan, they both heaved a sigh of relief. They were so worried that they would see Luo Fan's corpse here, or that they wouldn't even be able to see his corpse, although they didn't know the outcome of the battle now. At least Luo Fan was still alive. This was clearly enough. "Did you win?" Wen Miao asked after seeing Luo Fan. Luo Fan only smiled and said, "It was just a discussion. It's just a discussion of the Tao. How can there be victory or defeat? So you didn't lose? Why are you being humble with us? Don't you think we know your level?" Qing Longzi pursed his lips and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and didn't continue the topic. He turned to look at Wen Miao and Qing Longzi and realized that compared to before, the two of them had improved by quite a bit. The aura around them and the surging power of the space-time dimension were many times stronger than before. Faintly, he could even see some signs of the mysteries that he had comprehended from the supreme martial artist over the years. It was obvious that although they had only watched for a short while, they had already gained a lot. In the past 10,000 years, they had already turned this gain into their own strength. "I'm afraid I'll have to go into seclusion for a while," Luo Fan said with a smile. These words caused the two of them to come to a sudden realization. In their opinion, Luo Fan's seclusion must have been because he had gained a lot from the previous Tao discussion. Now, he needed to properly absorb his previous gains, just like what they had done in the past 10,000 years. Therefore, the two of them naturally didn't raise any objections and only nodded. Luo Fan didn't waste any time. After greeting them, he turned around and stepped into his cave abode. This cave abode was exactly the same as before. There was no difference at all. This was not the cave abode that the supreme martial artists had specially built according to the appearance of Luo Fan's cave abode. Instead, it was indeed the cave abode that Luo Fan had opened back then. The reason why it had reappeared after being destroyed was because the supreme martial artist had used his supreme power in the higher space-time dimension to pierce through time and space and grab the cave abode that had not been destroyed. If this was in other worlds, it wouldn't be an overly powerful technique. Even a demi-saint would probably be able to do it. However, in the higher space-time dimension, it wasn't a simple technique. It was impossible to pierce through time and space to grab something from the past without a deep understanding of the great Tao of the higher space-time dimension. What's more, the destruction of all of this was at its very core. It had practically been completely erased from time and space. It would be even more difficult to achieve this again. To be able to do this, there was no doubt that the supreme martial artists were powerful. Even Luo Fan's cave abode had been completely retrieved, let alone Wu Miao's and Qing Longzi's cave abodes. It was so much so that even the countless cloud beasts in the surrounding sea of clouds were the same as before. They were still roaming around as if nothing had happened, completely disregarding the passing of 10,000 years. Wu Miao and Qing Longzi were much calmer than they had been in the past. At this moment, when they saw Luo Fan turn around and step into the cave abode, they suddenly felt completely relaxed. Chapter 1865. Luo Fan's clone, which had stepped into the summoning channel, had completely lost control of its body. Like a fallen leaf in a gale, it could only move forward with the power of the channel. This channel was mysterious and different from all the channels he had seen in the past. There were no colorful lights or strange images in it. There was only a deep darkness. It was pitch black as if there was nothing there. In the deepest part of this pitch-black darkness there was a faint light. The intense summoning sound came from that light. The path of the clone was heading straight for that light. Obviously, that light was the exit of the summoning channel. In this channel, the feeling of time passing had been completely lost. Even the summoning sound seemed to be in a state where it was about to stop, which was very strange. If Luo Fan hadn't heard the summoning sound, the strange sound alone would have been enough to make one feel irritated to the point of breaking down. In this channel, Luo Fan's clone kept moving forward. After an unknown period of time, the light finally expanded into an exit and became a special light shadow in the boundless darkness. Luo Fan's clone directly passed through the light shadow and set foot on the source of the summoning sound. It was an altar. One of them seemed to be several thousand feet in circumference and was engraved with countless extremely complicated runes. Every single rune seemed to be drawn out of thin air by countless great daos, appearing unprecedentedly profound and mysterious. The moment he stepped onto the altar, his incarnation suddenly connected with his main body. This allowed his main body, which was in the higher space-time dimension, to clearly sense everything that had happened to the clone. He could even descend his spirit and place it on the clone. What a strange world! Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh when he saw everything around him. This was because this world was completely different from what he had imagined. This was a broken world. A broken world that could be seen in a state of chaos just by looking up. However, even in such a broken world, the laws were extremely powerful and strict. The suppressive power it produced was extremely strong. It had even surpassed the higher space-time dimensions. As soon as Luo Fan stepped into this place, the unique space-time dimension on his body had already endured a tremendous pressure that exceeded that of a higher space-time dimension. At this time, it was already making creaking sounds, traces of instability and cracks that even a higher dimensional space could not suppress were forced out at this moment, causing this unique dimensional space to appear as if it was wrapped in a gigantic and incomparably tight spider web. This place was not in a higher space-time dimension. However, the terrifying oppression of the nomological laws was already much stronger than the special characteristics of the higher space-time dimensions. Therefore, this caused the unique space-time dimension on Luo Fan's body, which could not be revealed in the normal world, to be revealed at this time. Of course, they were not in a higher space-time dimension after all, so this unique space-time dimension revealed its appearance. However, it was not a gray mist, but a transparent shadow. It looked as if there was a layer of liquid wrapped around his body. At this time, the liquid was filled with countless cracks, and under the invisible pressure of the outside world, it even began to shrink slowly. It gradually shrank towards the inside of his body. It's a pity that this is not a truly complete unique space-time dimension. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could only let out such a sigh. As he sighed, he suddenly had a thought. This unique space-time dimension began to shrink on its own, and in the blink of an eye, it had already shrunk to the surroundings of his life origin, simply wrapping around his life origin. Since he could already predict that he would not be able to withstand it and would definitely be crushed, there was naturally no need to continue to resist it. Taking the initiative to retreat and only protecting the most important thing was the wisest choice. At this time, a strange nomological law directly poured into Luo Fan's body. Under this nomological law, the supreme power that this incarnation originally contained, which even a third-level Supreme Emperor could not compare to, was completely dispersed at this moment. It directly split apart, completely turning into some mysterious and strange nomological law that integrated into his body. Following this change, he felt that his strength began to rapidly weaken. In the blink of an eye, he had already shrunk from the level of third-level Supreme Emperor to a level where he could not even compare to itinerant immortals. In other words, he had been compressed to the level of the mortal realm. Although he was still at the peak of the mortal realm, he had already lost the original power of immortality. At least, that was the case in terms of this body alone. However, this nomological law did not dissipate because of this. Instead, it began to penetrate deeper, and in the blink of an eye, it had already poured into the depths of his spirit, directly wrapping around his life origin, trying to change his life origin. It was a pity that the unique space-time dimension had shrunk to such an extent, and its defensive ability had already surpassed the nomological law. It was no longer something that the nomological law could shake. Therefore, even if the nomological law attacked millions of times, in the end, it still could not break through the defense of the unique space-time dimension. In the end, because of the changes to his spirit gained the characteristics of the nomological law and gradually assimilated the nomological law, causing the impact on the unique space-time dimension to gradually weaken. In the end, when Luo Fan's spirit had completely changed and turned into an extremely fragile existence, the nomological law finally no longer had any influence on his life origin. At this moment, apart from the life origin that was protected by the unique space-time dimension, Luo Fan's entire body had been assimilated by the nomological law of this world, and had completely turned into a form that was adapted to the nomological law of this world, Although his figure did not look any different from before, there was almost no resemblance between him and the past. Standing there, Luo Fan could only let out a long sigh. He began to slowly walk out of the altar. The surroundings of the altar were empty. It was completely empty. There were no living beings at all, and it was impossible to find the source of the summoning. It felt as if the summoning did not exist in the present, but had appeared in the distant past, or in the distant future. This altar with a circumference of 300 meters. If he was in the past, even if he was in a completely unfamiliar world where the binding power of the nomological law was beyond imagination, he would definitely be able to cross it with just a thought. However, at this moment, he could only walk out one step at a time. Compared to before, his body seemed to have become countless times heavier. It was as if his body had become countless times heavier than that of a mortal's. With every step he took, there would be a crackling sound coming from Luo Fan's body. It was as if the bones all over his body were constantly colliding with each step he took, and he seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. He had established his own unique worldview, and he had even set foot on the path to becoming a true sage. In fact, he was an existence that had already walked 1/3 of this path to becoming a true sage. His understanding of cultivation was so deep that he could even arrogantly claim that he was an existence that was second only to a true sage. In just a few steps, he had already mastered a certain nomological law of this world, and comprehended some of the cultivation mysteries of this world. Then, he adjusted his movements slightly. The bones in his body collided with each other, the movement of his internal organs, and the movement of his muscles. The flow of his blood began to undergo some subtle changes. Due to this change, some kind of essence began to continuously penetrate through the apertures all over his body, drilling into his body, and merging with his internal organs. It merged with his bones and meridians. As more and more essence entered his body, the pressure of the external force on his body began to weaken. It came from within his body. The crackling sound began to gradually decrease. In the end, when he walked out of the 300 meters, when he reached the edge of the altar, the sound had completely disappeared. At this moment, he felt that his cultivation had advanced a step, and he was about to break through the mortal realm and step into the itinerant immortal realm. It's so difficult. However, at this moment, Luo Fan's eyebrows were already furrowed. He was extremely dissatisfied with his cultivation progress. According to the essence he had absorbed and the cultivation mysteries of this world he had comprehended, he should at least be able to raise his cultivation to the pure sun realm after walking the 300 meters. However, he could not even break through the mortal realm, which was 3 large realms lower than he had expected. It would be strange if he was satisfied. After thinking about it for a while, he could not help but smile bitterly. It seems that the cultivation I put on this incarnation was not to increase the foundation of my body, nor was it to strengthen my body, but to transform it into a shackle. The stronger my original cultivation, the stronger the shackle was, and the harder it was to break it. It's only because of this that my progress has actually fallen to such a poor state. He sighed inwardly and walked down the altar that had a circumference of 1,000 feet. The altar was so huge that the stairs at the edge also spanned a great distance. However, it didn't feel like it was prepared for a being of his size. Instead, it felt like it was prepared for a being that was around 10 times taller than a being of his size. However, this was naturally not a problem for Luo Fan. Even if his progress was not satisfactory, he had now reached the peak of the mortal realm, and was an existence that could call the wind and summon the rain in the ordinary world. Naturally, it would not be an obstacle for him to climb such an extremely high flight of stairs. He immediately arrived at the bottom of the stairs in a few steps. This was a tall mountain. There was a vast square around the altar. At a glance, there was a boundless sea of clouds at the end of the square. It was the same in all directions, with no exception. In a certain direction there was a flight of stairs leading down. Compared to the stairs above the altar, the stairs leading down were ordinary stairs. Compared to the stairs below the altar, the stairs leading down were more than 10 times smaller. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan had some guesses in his heart. It seemed that the altar should be summoning some kind of creature that was at least 30 meters tall. Perhaps it was in human form, perhaps it was not. And these summoners should be some kind of medium-sized creature that was about the same size as him. It might also be in human form, or it might not be. Right at this moment, in the chaotic state that could be seen at a glance in the sky, there was suddenly an inexplicable turbulence. A vortex appeared in it. As this vortex appeared, a ball of fire flew out of it and smashed straight into the world. At this moment, a huge network appeared between heaven and earth. Luo Fan knew at a glance that this network was the law of heaven and earth. It was the law of heaven and earth. After this network appeared, it instantly wrapped around the ball of fire from all directions and began to entangle it, causing the light of the ball of fire to gradually shrink. Gradually, its true appearance was revealed. It was a planet. It was a dead planet, just like an ordinary meteorite. As this planet appeared, the network formed by the law of heaven and earth gradually disappeared, and the speed at which the planet descended began to increase. In the end, with a loud rumble, the whole world began to shake violently, as if it was suddenly grabbed by a big hand and started to shake continuously. However, for Luo Fan, right now, he could only guess the scene of the planet landing. This was because everything below was completely covered by the boundless sea of clouds. He looked over. He couldn't see the scene on the ground at all. All he could see was a boundless expanse of whiteness. A planet falling from the chaotic state. At this moment, Luo Fan came back to his senses, and this thought flashed through his mind. As he thought of this, his eyes lit up slightly. He was extremely glad that he had passed through the summoning channel and stepped into this world. Everything in this world, just what he had seen, was enough to pique his interest. Whether it was the unimaginably powerful law of heaven and earth, it was still the setting of the altar, and it was still the planet that fell from the chaotic state. Everything here was completely different from what he had understood in the past. In other words, everything here was brand new to him. It was all worth exploring, and it might form a strong stimulus to his worldview. For Luo Fan, no matter what it was, as long as it could stimulate his worldview, as long as it was enough to make him feel the imperfections of his worldview, then it would be the best thing and the best place to be. Under such circumstances, how could he not be glad that he had stepped into this world? With a slight thought, Luo Fan made a grabbing motion with his hand, and a large number of clouds in the boundless sea of clouds gathered in front of him. They gradually condensed and condensed in front of him. Gradually, under the influence of the law of heaven and earth, the large cluster of clouds finally made a soft poof sound and began to emit colorful rays of light. The originally scattered water vapor turned into some kind of mysterious substance. The mysteries of the law of heaven and earth penetrated this cluster of clouds, giving it all kinds of mysterious power. It's a pity that I'm still a little too weak. Otherwise, I wouldn't have only been tempered to this level. Looking at the colorful clouds, Luo Fan felt helpless again. This cluster of clouds was naturally the means of transportation that he had refined. For the current Luo Fan, everything in the world had its own uses. If he wanted a means of transportation, he could refine it with the things he had been tasked with. Clouds, water vapor, stones, wind, dust, grass, and so on. All of them could be done with just a thought. Even though he was only at the peak of the mortal realm in this world, and his control of the laws of heaven and earth was only at the elementary level, there were still countless methods he could use. Obviously, in the case of the boundless sea of clouds around him, it was obviously the most convenient to use the surrounding sea of clouds as materials. The colorful clouds that he had refined now already possessed extremely mysterious uses. If one had to forcibly classify them, they could actually be considered as an arcane treasure. However, due to the characteristics of the laws of heaven and earth, it could not display the various characteristics of arcane treasures, nor could it give birth to a treasure spirit. Such clouds could allow one to travel tens of thousands of kilometers in the blink of an eye. In any mortal world, it was a wonderful arcane treasure. However, to Luo Fan, this was clearly a choice he had made because he had no other choice. If his current cultivation could increase by a level, it would not be much. As long as he became an itinerant immortal, he would definitely be able to refine a cloud that was thousands of times faster than this. In fact, he did not even need to refine a cloud. Refining a door that could allow one to travel through time was a simple matter. Amidst his dissatisfaction, Luo Fan leaped onto the cloud. The feeling of touching his feet was extremely comfortable, making him feel as if he had fallen into cotton. Even his body and mind became extremely relaxed. With a thought, the 5-colored auspicious cloud started to tremble. It only left behind a 5-colored ray of light in the sea of clouds before disappearing around the mountain. The direction that the multicolored light was pointing at was none other than the planet that he had seen before, the planet that had descended from the state of chaos. The planet had landed extremely far away from here. A rough estimate would be at least hundreds of millions of kilometers away. Chapter 1867. However, chaos gems seemed to be quite valuable. Luo Fan turned to look at the barbarian with a thought. The best novel reading experience is at this moment, the savage was restrained by his shackles and had no strength left. He lay there motionlessly, as though he had just survived a disaster. After a long while, he realized that his sealed strength had not recovered. He could only climb up with difficulty and turned to look at Luo Fan, who was hundreds of miles away. Although he didn't have any strength left, his extraordinary physique still existed. Naturally, the powerful eyesight that came with that physique also existed. Hence, even though he was hundreds of miles away, he could see Luo Fan directly. He could identify the slightest change in his expression and see everything in his eyes. After a long while, he realized that Luo Fan's expression was as cold as steel and his eyes were fixed. He could only sigh and say, "What exactly do you want?" Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I've already said it before. You just rejected me." Hearing this, the savage finally remembered the words that Luo Fan had said to him when they met. For a moment, he couldn't help but feel regret. If he had known that Luo Fan would be so difficult to deal with, he would have definitely changed his attitude towards him. However, it was too late to say anything now. He could only say, "All right, I'll tell you what you want to know as long as you can help me recover my strength." That's naturally not a problem. Although sealing your strength isn't much pressure on me, it won't do me any good either. If you can satisfy me, I naturally won't seal your strength. Luo Fan only smiled. At this moment, the savage sighed and raised his hand to press on his head. With a forceful pull, a sparkling and translucent object that looked like a blue liquid crystal was pulled out of his head. This was his memory. For an ordinary cultivator, grabbing one's own memory required the assistance of power. It required the assistance of power, and it seemed to be a rather powerful one at that. However, for an existence like this savage, who could unleash terrifying power that surpassed the false sage stage at the Tai Pure Sun stage, his memory had already reached an unbelievable level. His control over his own mind had already reached an unbelievable level. The nature of his memories had completely changed, turning into an indescribable substance. He wanted to grab it out. If he wanted to grab it out, he no longer needed the help of any power. As long as he wanted to grab it, he would naturally be able to do so. Seeing that he directly grabbed his own memory, Luo Fan, who was about to ask a question, stopped talking. Compared to asking questions, it was naturally more convenient to directly read the memory. To ask questions, he had to ask them one by one. If there were any misunderstandings in the expression, it would cause the answers he got to be inaccurate. In comparison, he could just read the memory directly. Not only would it be faster, but it would also allow him to know whatever he wanted to know. After the savage grabbed the memory, his face turned slightly pale. Although he didn't need to use any power to grab these memories, the side effects caused by grabbing the memory would naturally be completely borne by his body. If he couldn't use any power to share the side effects, the effects would naturally be much greater than when he had power. Holding onto the crystal-clear memory, the barbarian threw it away. This mass of memories was like a baseball that had been thrown out. It began to quickly rush towards Luo Fan, who was 100 miles away. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of him, allowing him to grab it. He had already grabbed it in his hand. After grabbing the memory in his hand, he didn't hesitate. After checking it for a while, he sent his perception into the memory and began to read the information contained within. In the blink of an eye, countless lights and shadows appeared. Countless voices, countless words, exploded in his heart. In an instant, he was completely drowned. Luo Fan's thinking ability was extremely powerful. In the blink of an eye, he had already completely separated everything and sorted it out. As he sorted it out in the blink of an eye, he had already understood almost everything that the savage knew about this world. I didn't expect there to be such a magical world. It seems like I was right to come this time. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This savage was also not a native creature of this world. He was also a creature that had been summoned here by some sort of summoning from another world. However, compared to Luo Fan, he came in with his original body instead of an incarnation or a clone. In reality, living beings like him made up the vast majority of the world. It could be said that in this entire world, the creatures that were truly born and bred in this world were only a very, very small part of it. After learning about this, Luo Fan searched through the memories of the savage's experience before he entered this world. He wanted to find out where the world was and what it looked like. However, it was a pity that there seemed to be some mysterious power that completely erased everything. It made all the scenes before the savage stepped into this world disappear completely, as if they did not exist at all. As for why he was sure that it was the effect of some kind of power in this world and not the savage's own choice, it was very simple. This was because the erasure method was definitely not man-made. The erasure method was too perfect. Even Luo Fan could not do it. It was impossible for him to erase that kind of memory so cleanly, so naturally, and so without leaving any room for recovery. Even he could not do it, so he did not think that the savage could do it. Although he could not confirm the situation before the savage entered this world, just his understanding of this world was enough to make Luo Fan feel that he had made a huge profit. This part of the world was a broken world. This was the conclusion that the savage had obtained from his understanding and research of this world over the countless years he had been in this world. The reason why the world that was eternally indestructible and free from tribulations and immeasurable had become so broken was not complicated at all. According to legend, countless years ago, several existences that were about to break through to the true saint realm were born in this world. These existences were fighting for something unknown or for an unknown opportunity, and a shocking battle broke out. That battle destroyed everything in this world. It caused the world to be shattered into countless pieces and begin to move towards destruction. There was no possibility of it being restored. This place was the main fragment of the world. It was also the largest piece among the countless fragments. At this moment, the battle remnants that filled this region were still affecting the heavens and earth, causing destruction to the heavens and earth, constantly causing this world to move towards destruction, towards extinction. According to the calculations of countless predecessors, this world could only last for a few billion trillion years at most. After a few billion trillion years, the world would be completely engulfed by the state of chaos and become a part of it. In fact, during that research, one could even learn about the summoning of these living beings. It was the summoning of the living beings that had been in despair during the battle of the peak true saint existences a long time ago. The reason why the summoning only took effect after such a long time was because of the influence of the power of a true saint. In other words, because the power of a true saint had distorted the power of the summoning, it caused the summoning to transcend time. In the end, it might have been triggered a long time ago or a long time later, which caused Luo Fan to only appear here now that this world had been broken. However, even though this world was already broken, it could even be considered to be completely destroyed by the state of chaos. However, there was also a benefit to this place. That was, one could obtain countless treasures that had fallen from the state of chaos here. For example, the planet that had appeared here was one of the most common treasures. This chaos planet was originally a part of this world. However, because it had been shattered by the battle of the true saint, it had entered the state of chaos and was eventually invaded by the state of chaos. It was tempered, worn down, changed, and finally erased its original nature, transforming it into an existence that only existed in the state of chaos. The Chaos Planet. Because this Chaos Planet was originally a part of the world, it had a core law that merged into one. Under the control of this core law, the Chaos Planets would continuously move towards the largest fragment, eventually penetrating the state of chaos and smashing into this world. If the world wasn't broken, it would obviously be a great perfection to the world. However, at this time, when the world was already broken to such an extent, this was the destruction of this world again and again. Every chaos planet that smashed into this world was a huge impact on this world. Every time it struck, it would destroy the world once more, causing it to become even more dilapidated, bringing it closer to death. However, this was only for this world. For the living beings in this world, every chaos planet that smashed into this world was equivalent to a huge opportunity. It could allow them to obtain countless precious materials and precious mysteries that could only be found in the state of chaos. For example, the Chaos Stone was one of the most common type. The Chaos Stone was a type of material that could preserve the mysteries of the state of chaos to the greatest extent. After being tempered countless times in the state of chaos, the mysteries of the state of chaos would unknowingly condense within the material. Although it was called a stone, it could actually exist in any form. Liquid, solid, gas, and even invisible existences could appear. In fact, the reason why it was called a chaos stone was because it was a more common form of existence. Among the various things that fell from the state of chaos, apart from the chaos planet, there were also various other special existences. Sometimes it was some kind of treasure fragment. Sometimes it was even some kind of corpse, some kind of animal, some kind of plant. Any one of them would make the living beings in this world go completely crazy. This was because any one of them represented an existence related to a true saint. If it wasn't a chaos planet that fell from the state of chaos this time, but something that existed in other forms, it would have arrived here at this time. It wouldn't have been just a few hundred living beings. At that time, there would probably be hundreds of thousands or even millions of living beings here. Furthermore, the living beings there wouldn't just be weak existences like this savage. At that time, there might even be supreme existences that could become false saints in this world. It's actually a broken world. After receiving the memories of the savage, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little emotional. He now understood why the laws of this world were so powerful and why this world was so broken. He now completely understood why this world could directly see the state of chaos and why this place was so desolate. A great world was a perfect world that could only be formed after going through 9 great tribulations. Just from the difficulty of achieving it, it was enough to show how powerful and terrifying a great world was. Even if such a great world was shattered and broken, it would definitely be many times stronger than an ordinary perfect world. It was only natural for its laws to have such a performance. As for the various kinds of breakdowns, there was no need to say much. If such a powerful great world had not been shattered to this extent, how could it not have recovered? What kind of realm is above a true saint? As he thought about it, he had another doubt. For the current him, even if he had found the path to become a true saint and had already taken nearly 3 steps on this path, his current ultimate goal was still to become a true saint. It was just the mixed essence Tao fruit. For him, how exactly did a true saint level cultivate, how to improve, what kind of realm was there above true saint, and how to break through? How should he break through? This was simply like a matter of another world, making it difficult for him to feel any sense of reality. After thinking for a long time, he sighed and dispelled all these thoughts. For the current him, everything was still too far. It was still too far away, however. Even if he had dispelled all these thoughts, he still felt that the world in his heart seemed to have undergone a subtle change. It was as if it had suddenly broadened and become much more profound. Although he no longer thought about what kind of realm was above true saint, he had after all confirmed that there was a realm above it, and this confirmation suddenly made him feel, never before, that there was no end to cultivation. Even if he was a true saint, it was just a stage in the process of cultivation, not the end of cultivation. There might even be countless realms above it waiting for him to climb, waiting for him to cross this change in perception, at this time, although at this time, it did not immediately raise his cultivation level. However, it had already faintly impacted his worldview, making him feel that his worldview was faintly moving towards a more perfect level. The worldview was the condensation of one's own understanding of the world, heaven and earth, the state of chaos, and everything else. The understanding of cultivation was also a part of it. At this time, Luo Fan's understanding of cultivation realm had been improved and expanded, so how could his worldview not change at the same time? I wonder if you're satisfied? The savage's voice rang in Luo Fan's ears, waking him up from his thoughts. Very satisfied. Luo Fan smiled. As he smiled, he did not hesitate. With a thought, he used his own strength to directly control the shackles and release the seal on the savage. In an instant, the savage felt his body become lighter. As the strength in his body surged, a powerful pressure burst out from his body, directly causing the surrounding void to make crackling sounds. In the blink of an eye, he had grown from an ordinary savage to a primordial unity pure yang expert. However, all of his powers had been restored. After the savage recovered, a relaxed look appeared on his face. Power was the source of a sense of security. I thought you wouldn't let me off so easily. The savage looked at Luo Fan with surprise and gratitude in his eyes. This broken world was definitely a place where the strong preyed on the weak. Otherwise, this savage would not have had such a bad attitude when he saw Luo Fan. In a world where the strong preyed on the weak, if a living being controlled another living being, it would not let it off so easily. He was even prepared to be slaughtered by Luo Fan a few more times. Now that Luo Fan had actually kept his promise and released his control over him, it was simply a shocking surprise to him. Luo Fan only said, "You've already given me what I need. What's the point of me controlling you?" The savage did not say anything else. He only cupped his hands and told Yi Shiwen to take care. Then, he turned around and rushed out of the chaotic planet without looking back. He no longer cared about the existence of an extremely large number of chaos gems. To him, although the chaos gems were good, the feeling of staying here and facing Luo Fan was really unpleasant, and the danger was too great. Therefore, in comparison, giving up this opportunity to plunder the chaotic gems and waiting for the next opportunity was a wiser choice. Luo Fan did not care about the savage's departure. Chapter 1869. After dealing with the 3 of them, Luo Fan sighed. After bypassing the shackles on his body with the help of the chaos gems, the power of his divine ability was much stronger than before. Vaguely, he was able to see this world more and more clearly. The nomological laws were still extremely strict and stubborn. However, at this moment, he could already see some things that he hadn't been able to see before from behind this strictness and stubbornness. There were some fractures. There were some fractures that shouldn't exist, but were already there. These fractures were extremely mysterious. Only Luo Fan, who had raised his cultivation to the itinerant immortal realm, could be considered to have broken through the mortal realm and stepped into the immortal realm. Moreover, he could only see them after he had broken through this world and obtained some kind of blessing from the laws of heaven and earth. In fact, the existence of these fractures didn't have much impact on the laws of heaven and earth. It wouldn't make the laws of heaven and earth broken and easy to break through because of this. The gap between the perfect world and the great world is really too big. Looking at the various fractures and analyzing the impact of these fractures on the laws of heaven and earth, Luo Fan could only come to this conclusion in the end. The laws of heaven and earth were broken and missing, which would definitely have an impact on the laws of heaven and earth. However, he couldn't feel it at all now. This was because his sensing ability wasn't strong enough. The more important reason was that, even though the laws of heaven and earth had become broken and full of loopholes, compared to the perfect world, they were still more perfect, tighter, and more perfect. That was the only way. Luo Fan was extremely familiar with the laws of heaven and earth. That was why he couldn't discover the impact of these fractures at all. That was why he didn't feel that the loss of the laws of heaven and earth would cause harm to the world. From this, he could naturally infer how much stronger the great world was compared to the perfect world. With this understanding, Luo Fan quickly got rid of this feeling in his heart and developed a strong desire for knowledge. The more perfect the laws of heaven and earth were, the more mysteries they contained, and the more truths they contained that could impact his view of the world. Don't look at how Luo Fan had been trying to recover his cultivation. In order to recover his cultivation, he had not forgotten that his worldview was his foundation. It didn't matter how much cultivation he had recovered here. No matter how many benefits he obtained here, as long as all of this didn't translate into progress in his worldview, it would be considered a failure to him. Obviously, Luo Fan didn't miss the point. At this time, his thoughts were naturally focused on perfecting his worldview. However, I'm only an itinerant immortal now. What I've come into contact with is only the surface level of the laws. If I want to truly see the deeper level of the laws, I still need to raise my cultivation. With a thought, he had already determined what he should do next. After clarifying his goal, he suddenly sighed again. It's much more difficult to bypass the shackles than before. The Chaos Gems are still useful at this stage, but I'm afraid I'll have to find other ways after I recover to the primordial pure yang level. He already had a clear understanding of how precious a Chaos Gem was from the savage's memory. Normally speaking, even the false sage of this world would be overjoyed if he obtained a Chaos Stone. But now, a Chaos Gem had only helped him step from the peak of the mortal realm to the itinerant immortal realm, and it had already consumed most of his power. The huge consumption was self-evident. Since he had already completed his goal of leaving the Chaos Planet this time, Luo Fan naturally didn't need to continue leaving. Immediately, he turned around and flew toward the Chaos Planet. Compared to before, his flying speed had increased by tens of thousands of times. In less than a 10,000th of the time before, he had already traversed a long distance and landed on a location on the Chaos Planet. This place was different from the place where he had dug out the Chaos Gem previously. The Chaos Gem was an extremely precious and rare treasure. Generally speaking, it would be very difficult for another Chaos Gem to appear in an area. Just now, he had dug out a Chaos Gem at that location. If he wanted more Chaos Gems, of course, he couldn't go to that location again. There were no other living beings around the location he had chosen. The reason why he chose this place was because he had relied on his eyesight, which had improved by many times, to see that there was a high possibility of the existence of a Chaos Gem in this location. Moreover, The quality of the Chaos Gem was very likely to be stronger than the one he had obtained previously. As he swept his gaze over, the Chaos Planet had already turned into various rays of light in his eyes. Then, he instantly picked out one of the key positions. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and condensed it. A powerful force rushed out of his hand and poured into that location. This force carried the boundless laws of the surroundings and erupted with a power that surpassed that of a despoter. It poured into that piece of land brazenly. There was a soft sizzling sound. That piece of land was like plasticine. It couldn't stop this force at all and was easily poured into it. As the soil churned, a fist-sized pit began to appear and continued to deepen as he moved. "Looks like I'm out of luck this time." After a while, Luo Fan let out a sigh and left this place. He had already dug for hundreds of thousands of miles, but what he had finally dug out was a strange ball of light. That ball of light itself was a little strange, but it was really too unstable. The moment it was dug out, it had already penetrated space-time and disappeared without a trace in an extremely strange way. It had merged with the laws of the universe, leaving only an afterimage. This change, no matter how fast Luo Fan was, he couldn't stop it at all. Its disappearance seemed to have happened in an instant, but in fact it had penetrated space-time. The process of its disappearance might have happened in the past. It might also have happened in the future, in a situation where he couldn't catch any traces of it at all. Unless Luo Fan's current cultivation had completely recovered to its peak, how could he catch it? However, whether he could catch it or not was secondary. More importantly, the existence of this ball of light meant that his previous observations were wrong. There were no Chaos Gems here. Next, Luo Fan went to more than 30 places that might have Chaos Gems. However, in the end, he discovered there were no Chaos Gems in any of them, although he didn't end up empty-handed in the process and obtained a material that was second only to the Chaos Gems. He was still quite disappointed. However, this was also to be expected. If Chaos Gems were really so easy to obtain, why would those cultivators block the road and rob it? How could there be so few living beings on this Chaos planet who came here to dig? It seems that my luck was really heaven-defying back then. That's why I was able to dig out a Chaos Gems on my first dig. As he sighed, he felt inexplicably lucky. If he hadn't dug out a Chaos Gems on his first try, he would probably still be at the peak of the mortal realm and wouldn't be able to dig out this Chaos planet so easily. When he arrived at the 31st spot, Luo Fan carefully measured it. Picking the most likely location, he unleashed his power, brazenly piercing through the earth and digging a long tunnel that led hundreds of thousands of kilometers underground. The deeper he went, the brighter the light of the Chaos Gems became, and the stronger the aura that belonged to the Chaos Gems became. If this was the first time he encountered such a situation, Luo Fan might have already confirmed that there were Chaos Gems here. However, with the previous 30 times, he knew that even so, there might not necessarily be Chaos Gems there. During those 30 times, there were several times where the signs of the existence of Chaos Gems were even more obvious and intense than this. However, in the end, he either didn't obtain anything or only saw the shadow of a Chaos Gems. In the end, he didn't even obtain a single Chaos Gem. It's not there yet? When he reached the deepest part of the excavation, Luo Fan's heart couldn't help but skip a beat. Even at this depth, which was already hundreds of thousands of miles deep, the aura of the Chaos Gems was still constantly increasing. However, it still didn't dissipate like before, nor did it directly disappear. Logically speaking, it was obvious that the Chaos Gems should be at a deeper level. Could there really be Chaos Gems? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Such an intense aura still existed hundreds of thousands of miles down. Just how big and how high the quality of the Chaos Gems must be. This was enough to make one look forward to it. Even if this person was Luo Fan, just as hope gradually surged in Luo Fan's heart, a strange obstruction suddenly appeared in front of his power. This kind of obstruction was extremely strange. It seemed to be extremely sturdy, yet it seemed to be extremely fragile. It blocked his power, giving him a feeling that he would never be able to break it. At the same time, he felt that he only needed to exert a little bit of force to instantly shatter it. The combination of these two completely opposite feelings was both contradictory and natural. Looks like it's not a chaos gem. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, after having this thought, he rushed down without hesitation. It wasn't a chaos gem, but he felt that it was definitely something countless times more precious than a chaos gem. Perhaps it wasn't even something, but something that was countless times more precious than the discovery of the chaos gems. For Luo Fan, a distance of hundreds of thousands of miles was an extremely short distance, even though he was only an itinerant immortal. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of the barrier. He quietly floated in front of him. Although this deep pit was extremely small, the size was clearly no obstacle to him. He floated in the depths of this deep pit, but it didn't seem crowded at all. This was a light screen. It was a screen of light that, from the looks of it, was immeasurably vast. There seemed to be many strange existences behind this light screen. However, even with Luo Fan's eyesight, he couldn't see through this light screen at all to see what was behind it. His heart stirred slightly. Power surged from Luo Fan's body. Under his power, the boundless nomological laws in the surroundings naturally began to release power in all directions. This power was boundlessly terrifying. It instantly shattered the surrounding ground, causing a space with a circumference of hundreds of feet to appear. It formed an underground space. Finally, Luo Fan wasn't like before, where he could only hide in a small deep pit. However, even so, he didn't seem to have reached the edge of this light screen. This light screen still completely filled his feet, but he still couldn't see what the overall shape of this light screen looked like. If it's spherical, this thing is probably quite big. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he looked at this light screen. With this thought in mind, however, he stopped his plans to expand further. After thinking for a while, he slowly descended and raised his hand to press on this light screen. The aura of the chaos gems was emitted from this light screen. However, there wasn't the slightest aura of the chaos gems on this light screen. Within it, Luo Fan could feel a pure power that repelled everything. Even the chaos gems seemed to be repelled by this pure power. This power wasn't unchanging at this moment. It was constantly undergoing countless changes, but these changes didn't seem to have any effect on it. They were so fast that they seemed to surpass time and space. Even Luo Fan couldn't grasp any of the specific changes. He could only vaguely feel the existence of those changes. There seems to be a space inside. With a thought, Luo Fan already had a guess about the existence of this light screen. With a thought, his perception began to slowly seep into the light screen. In an instant, countless streams of light rushed toward him, completely drowning his perception. These streaks of light were terrifyingly powerful. Every single one of them contained astonishing destructive power. After a few waves, his perception had already become riddled with holes and was in tatters. If Luo Fan was just an ordinary person, this kind of change would be enough to damage his soul, and he wouldn't be able to recover for a long time. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan, whose worldview of laws had already deeply integrated with him, only frowned at this kind of damage. Although this kind of impact was terrifying, it didn't involve the impact on his worldview. To him, such an impact was like scratching an itch through his boot. Although it looked tragic, as long as his worldview of laws surged, he could naturally recover as if he had never suffered any damage. It really is a kind of defense that specifically targets the chaos gems. After withdrawing his perception, Luo Fan couldn't help but show an inexplicable shock on his face. This light screen was a kind of defense, and this kind of defense was not aimed at anything else but the chaos gems. If that was the case, Luo Fan wouldn't have been so shocked. What really shocked him was that the person who built this light screen defense wasn't a true sage. Instead, it was a cultivator who hadn't become a true sage. If a true sage could build a light screen to defend against the chaos gems, it would be a matter of course. Although he would feel happy, excited, or fearful because of this discovery, he wouldn't be shocked. Only this kind of method, which clearly didn't have the ability to forcefully make the impossible possible, would shock him. This conclusion was obtained by Luo Fan through his own analysis of the countless streams of light that had attacked his perception in the light screen. After the shock, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. His body shook, and gradually, an inexplicable light began to gradually radiate from his body. This kind of light was extremely similar to the streams of light that had attacked his perception previously. After appearing, his body became a little illusory and blurry, as if it was gradually disappearing. At this moment, the light screen seemed to sense the changes in Luo Fan and suddenly produced a suction force that directly acted on his body. With a pull, he was pulled into the light screen. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that there were countless streams of light flashing around him, and he was wrapped in these streams of light as he flew in a certain direction. This light screen was incomparably huge. At least, from his current point of view, which had turned into a stream of light, it was so vast that he couldn't see the end at all, as if there were countless billions of light years. And in this place, time seemed to have no meaning. Luo Fan didn't know how long he had turned into a stream of light, but suddenly, his body stopped. All the streams of light had broken through a layer of barrier and stepped into a strange world. "I've arrived." Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he instantly made a prompt decision. All the light disappeared, and his body was revealed again. At this moment, the force that had previously pushed him to move quickly changed direction, and he was thrown out of the stream of light. After a moment of dizziness, Luo Fan stabilized his body in midair. The nomological laws have changed, space has changed, time has changed, and Yuan Qi has changed. Before he could pay attention to his surroundings, the various senses transmitted from heaven and earth had already told him that this place was different, and he was convinced that he had arrived in a completely unfamiliar place. The nomological laws here were actually stricter and more complete than in the outside world. There were actually fewer cracks in the nomological laws than in the outside world. Moreover, space and time were also more stable than in the outside world. Chapter 1870. Luo Fan carefully sensed the laws that were of the same origin as the outside world. Only then did he turn his attention to the outside world and began to observe the world. This was an incomparably vast world. The entire world was like a paradise on earth, but it was not as barren as the outside world. There were mountains, rivers, forests, and grasslands. All kinds of creatures were either leisurely or nervously moving about in the forests, on the grasslands, or in the sky. In the sky, streams of light emerged from the void and entered another part of the void. It looked as if rainbows had appeared in the sky. Behind Luo Fan, there was such a rainbow. It was also the position he had just entered. The countless rainbows hung in the sky in an extremely mysterious manner, forming a mysterious formation. It fused with the laws of the world and constructed a wondrous effect that even Luo Fan could not understand, making the world even more wondrous. Where is he? Luo Fan's gaze swept over and a strange thought flashed through his mind. This world was indeed extremely peaceful, but other than this peace, there were no signs of man-made existence. The entire world was a natural landscape. This situation was completely different from what he had expected. It should be noted that the light screen from before was clearly constructed by a cultivator, a mysterious light screen specifically used to defend against the impact of the chaotic state. Since such a barrier of light had already been constructed, naturally it had its uses, and the most normal conjecture was useless. Clearly, those living beings wanted to borrow this light barrier to avoid the corrosion and suppression of the primal chaos. In that case, they would naturally be within the light barrier. If that was the case, even if a long period of time had passed, he would not be able to do so. With their strength, given their methods, there would definitely be some kind of trace left behind. There was even a high possibility that he was still alive. However, that was not the case in reality. There were no signs of human activity in this world, and from what he could sense, there were no truly powerful cultivators here either. This made him very confused for a moment. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan descended. It descended towards the highest peak in the world. This highest peak was an extremely special location in this world. If there was anything unusual, it was obviously the most likely place to find clues. The landing process was very smooth. Not long after, Luo Fan's figure had already landed on the mountain peak, and he stood directly at the top of the mountain. Nothing happened? As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan felt that the fog was getting thicker. With a slight scan, he could sense that there were no truly powerful creatures on this mountain. Even the strongest among them was merely at the innate golden immortal realm. Although he wasn't weak, it was obvious that he was at the level of an ant in his eyes. Moreover, with this kind of strength, it did not seem to be qualified to occupy the highest peak of this world, regardless of whether the cultivation environment of the highest peak was good or bad. It had such a special characteristic. With such a characteristic, it was impossible for no living beings to pay attention to it. In this case, if one wanted to occupy the highest peak without sufficient strength, the risk one had to take would obviously not be small. Compared to the rewards, it was obviously not equal. With that being the case, even if the living beings here were not the strongest, they should not be too weak. This was clearly contrary to the current situation on the mountain peak. Let me take a look at their memories first. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's figure flashed and went towards the most powerful innate golden immortal realm living being on the mountain peak. That living being was a living being that looked like a black bear. Although it was extremely huge and was several thousands of feet tall, it was extremely weak in Luo Fan's eyes. After arriving here, Luo Fan did not even give the black bear time to react. He had already stepped on the black bear's head with a slight force. He had already used the shackles on his body to completely seal off all of the black bear's ability to resist, causing the black bear to be left with only its huge body in an instant. It could no longer use any strength. The black bear was originally sleeping soundly in its den. However, it did not expect such a terrifying power to suddenly descend from the sky and pour into its body, completely suppressing it. This caused it to suddenly wake up. However, it only had time to let out a furious roar before it lay there motionlessly. So powerful! Sensing the terrifying power that came from the shackles, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. One must know that this living being was only at the innate golden immortal realm. However, the power that it struggled with just now far surpassed that of a false saint. It felt like even a despairing person would collapse in an instant under this kind of power. It's actually stronger than the living beings in the outside world. Is this because of the laws of this world? With this thought in mind, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and a wave of power poured into the black bear's body. It began to flow along the power in its body and into its memories. He began to read the black bear's memories without any scruples. At this moment, endless information poured into Luo Fan's memories. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying power descended from the sky and landed on his body. This power was so terrifying that it was as if it was going to destroy the world. Even Luo Fan felt his body tremble at this moment, and he was almost completely crushed. Fortunately, at this critical moment, he instinctively activated the shackles that imprisoned his cultivation, allowing the shackles to block this terrifying power. Boom! This was a mountain that had stood tall in this world for countless years. The highest mountain in this world collapsed with a loud bang. It collapsed with a loud rumble, completely turning into powder, disappearing without a trace. Along with this mountain, the countless living beings on this mountain also disappeared, including the black bear that was currently sealed by Luo Fan's shackles. At this time, Luo Fan was obviously not in the mood to pay attention to the situation of the mountain at this moment. At this moment, his entire body was filled with displeasure. His mind was tightly locked on to the shackles on his body. He used the power of the shackles to continuously block the power that wanted to completely destroy his body, so that his body could remain intact during this process. Of course, this intact state was obviously somewhat exaggerated. This indescribable power contained a type of pressure that had a great effect on willpower and mind. This pressure pressed down on his will and his mind, causing him to have a kind of will of his own. Even his mind was rattling. It was as if he was about to be crushed and completely destroyed. Who the hell is attacking me? This thought flashed across his mind, and with great difficulty, he mobilized the shackles to resist all the negative attacks on him. This kind of shackles, not only did it target his power, but it also targeted his mind, his willpower, and everything about him. Therefore, this kind of shackles could naturally deal with all the attacks. Therefore, after Luo Fan fully mobilized the power of the shackles, the power that constantly crushed him and wanted to completely destroy him finally gradually dissipated. Not long after, the world became clear again. However, only Luo Fan was left floating in the void. The mountain under his feet had now turned into a deep pit, which was almost tens of thousands of miles deep, and one could even see the surging magma in the pit. All of a sudden, a light crack came from Luo Fan's body. With this sound, he felt the shackles on his body loosen, as if the originally almost absolute power of confinement had disappeared a little. This situation made Luo Fan's heart change, and a look of horror appeared on his face. The shackles have been broken? With a slight thought, he slightly operated his cultivation, and the individual immortal realm began to rise uncontrollably. In the blink of an eye, he had broken through the individual immortal realm and stepped into the genuine immortal realm. In the blink of an eye, he had broken through the genuine immortal realm and stepped into the golden immortal realm. Individual immortal, genuine immortal, and golden immortal were the first great realm above the mortal realm, and three of the three realms of the earthly immortal realm. Given the power of the shackles, Luo Fan had originally planned to spend at least dozens of chaos gems to bypass the shackles and cross the three realms. He had not expected that after withstanding the pressure of that strange power, he had already crossed the three realms and completed the process that he had expected to take hundreds of years to complete. With Luo Fan's foundation, this kind of progress was enough for him to burst out with the strength of a third-level Supreme Emperor. However, at this point, there was not much joy on Luo Fan's face. On the contrary, his frown deepened. The reason for this was because he knew very well that the power of the existence that could break this shackle must be at least stronger than when I was at my peak. Because that power had appeared out of nowhere, Luo Fan had only read a little of the Black Bear's memory. Those memories were not of much use at all. For the Black Bear, which did not have much intelligence, it had been on this mountain since it was born. All along, it had been eating when it was hungry, sleeping when it was hungry, and eating when it was hungry. Such a memory, for Luo Fan, what meaning did it have? After waiting for a while, when he realized that the power did not appear again, Luo Fan could not help but feel puzzled again. How did I trigger that kind of power just now? After waiting for such a long time, that kind of power had not appeared. In that case, he could boldly guess that the existence that attacked him just now was not some kind of intelligent creature with intelligence. Perhaps it was not the intelligent creature that he understood, but some kind of mechanism. Perhaps it was some kind of law of this heaven and earth, or the deeply hidden great Tao, or perhaps it was the heaven and earth's will. Thinking of the last possibility, Luo Fan's eyes flashed. It was the possibility of the heaven and earth's will. It seemed to be quite big when he had helped the heaven and earth through the great calamity, He had some understanding of the heaven and earth's will. This allowed him to be somewhat familiar with the way the heaven and earth's will work. For the heaven and earth's will to attack him directly without any warning, that did not seem strange. Then let me see if it is the heaven and earth's will. He instantly made a decision in his heart. The heaven and earth itself was a part of the great heaven and earth. This was something that Luo Fan was already quite certain of. And the great Tao of the great heaven and earth had already surpassed the limits that Luo Fan could grasp at the moment. At the very least, with his current cultivation of the golden immortal realm, he could not even step into the unseen world, let alone see the great Tao with his own eyes. And he could not even see the great Tao with his own eyes. This heaven and earth's will, which was more obscure and mysterious than the great Tao, exceeded the limits of his power. Therefore, it was clearly impossible for Luo Fan to directly look for the heaven and earth's will and find out why it had attacked him. However, even if he could not do it directly, it was not difficult to use indirect methods to probe it. He secretly recalled all the things that had happened before. Luo Fan already had some guesses in his heart. With a thought, he spread out his perception and began to search for the place he wanted to find in this heaven and earth. Compared to when he had just stepped into this heaven and earth, when he was only an itinerant immortal, he was now many times more powerful. At this level of him, his sensing ability and his ability to see the essence of phenomena had both become much stronger. With just a glance, the endless and complicated laws around him had already been pushed aside layer by layer. Countless mysteries hidden behind the chaos were gradually grasped by him. All of a sudden, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. He had finally found something that he wanted to find. With a thought, he passed through space-time in a flash and directly arrived in this heaven and earth. He was in a place that was tens of thousands of light-years away from the deep pit he was originally in. This was a grassland. There was a floating island in the sky above the grassland. Or, to be more specific, it was a floating continent. The floating continent covered an area of hundreds of millions of kilometers. It floated in the sky, but it seemed to cover the sky and the sun. It covered the land, causing the grassland to be in a state where it could not see the sky all year round. However, this did not mean that it was completely dark here. Any heaven and earth was extremely mysterious, let alone this heaven and earth. There was a huge continent covering the sky, covering the sun, moon, and stars. For the sake of survival, the various creatures below would naturally make corresponding adjustments. Therefore, there were countless plants that could glow in the grassland at this time. The light emitted by these plants varied. Some were strong, some were weak, but when combined, it made this place brighter and more dazzling than the light in the outside world. It was impossible to tell that this place was covered by the continent at all. Let me see if my guess is correct. With a thought, Luo Fan's figure flashed and arrived in front of a dazzling tree near the center of the grassland below. This tree was tens of thousands of meters tall. Its largest trunk was like a huge mountain, and its branches and leaves covered an area with a radius of nearly 10,000 kilometers. Standing in front of this tree and looking up, it seemed like the tree was holding up the sky. Even though the floating continent was hundreds of millions of kilometers in circumference, it was still an insignificant speck compared to the entire world. Compared to the previous tallest mountain peak, it was only slightly larger. However, the nomological laws here were the densest and densest in the entire heaven and earth. Especially around the tree in front of Luo Fan at this moment, it was even more so. Faintly, countless nomological laws were wrapped around the branches of this tree, continuously injecting all sorts of mysterious powers into the tree, causing it to constantly emit that mysterious light, turning it into the sun in this grassland that was covered. After looking at this tree for a while, Luo Fan had already made his move. With a thought, he took a step forward and stood on the trunk of the tree. At the top, although it was emitting an extremely intense light that did not seem like it belonged to the sun. However, for Luo Fan, this kind of light was nothing at all. He did not even need to close his eyes to endure it. At the top of this trunk was the densest nomological laws on this tree. It felt as if every nomological law in this heaven and earth had gone through various twists and turns. It was as if they were connected to this mountain-like trunk. Luo Fan raised his vigilance to the highest level. Then, he slowly extended his hand and an inexplicable power covered his hand like a glove. Then, he slowly reached for the trunk and the nomological laws that were connected to it. Soon, he had completely grasped the trunk in his hands with the help of this power. Nothing happened. It seems like this alone is not enough. As this thought flashed through his mind, the power in Luo Fan's hand began to gradually produce an inexplicable fluctuation. His senses began to follow this fluctuation and gradually fuse with the nomological laws that were connected to the trunk. Then, all sorts of mysterious information began to frantically pour into his senses from the nomological laws and quickly swarmed into his memories. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying power was born out of thin air and descended on his body, crushing him in a frenzy. In the face of this terrifying power, Luo Fan sighed. It seems like the will of the world is indeed making a move against me. Chapter 1871. In the blink of an eye, his eyes had completely changed. It was as if they had turned into two extremely deep and profound universes, producing an indescribable attraction. In an instant, the pair of eyes had been transformed by the boundless laws of law that Luo Fan had connected to with the tree, turning into a unique divine eye that was completely born according to the laws of the heavens and earth. This pair of eyes was similar to the Pangu spirit eye that he had cultivated in the primordial world. However, it also possessed all sorts of supreme power that ordinary glasses did not have. It was enough for him to easily see through everything he wanted to see through. This method seemed mysterious, but it was actually a choice made under helplessness. If Luo Fan's current strength was at its peak and he was not sealed or restricted, why would he need to transform his eyes? Anything he wanted to see clearly, as long as his eyes swept over it, he would be able to see it clearly. However, there was no other way now. Although his cultivation had recovered to the golden immortal realm, compared to him in the past, he was really not even an ant. In the face of such a world, if he did not transform his eyes, everything he saw would be separated by a layer. If he wanted to see everything he wanted to see clearly, it would take too much energy. In the face of the situation where the will of the world was targeting him, if he did not transform his eyes, he would probably not even be able to unleash the strength that he had already recovered the moment the pair of divine eyes was formed. The world in Luo Fan's eyes had already undergone an earth-shattering change. In the blink of an eye, the countless light shadows completely disappeared. The colorful world in front of him had completely disappeared. Replacing it was a world that was outlined by countless lines. These were the essence of this world, and also the foundation that supported it. These countless lines were all the laws that existed in this world. There were nodes among them. They were the intersection of the laws. And everything in the world was the fluctuation of the laws. After the countless laws, there was a stream of light. It was a stream of light that was extremely similar to the light shadow that Luo Fan had seen before he had passed through the light screen and entered this world. These streams of light flowed endlessly behind the network, displaying all sorts of unfathomable mysteries as the void changed. Apart from that, there was also an extremely thick layer of fog that covered the sky above. Of course, from Luo Fan's current point of view, this kind of upper position could only be seen from above. In fact, it was just a metaphysical upper limit. In other words, it was abstract. It was completely according to Luo Fan's own concept, according to his understanding of the definition above. That position could be behind the rules and laws, or it could be below, or it could be a special existence that existed everywhere. At this moment, an incomparably thick beam of light was condensed from countless rays of light. This beam of light, which contained an unknown number of laws and principles, shot down from the depths of the dense fog and rushed towards Luo Fan at an incomparably fast speed. The destructive aura it exuded was enough to make any living creature unable to move. Facing such an attack, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. In an instant, the countless rules and laws around his body naturally distorted. Amidst this distortion, a lens-like structure appeared above his head, directly blocking the beam of light descending from the sky. In an instant, the beam of light penetrated the lens and suddenly dispersed. 99% of its power dissipated in an instant, leaving only a portion of its power that continued to rush towards Luo Fan. Facing such an attack that had been reduced by 100-fold, Luo Fan's heart jolted. He raised his hand and clenched his fist, instantly smashing the remaining 1% of its power, causing the rules and laws contained within to completely dissipate. At this moment, a cracking sound came from under his feet. It was the shockingly huge tree that had withstood the impact of the remaining 99% of the power. At this moment it could no longer withstand it, and millions of dense cracks suddenly appeared on its surface. These countless cracks penetrated the entire tree, penetrated the ground from the treetop, and reached the depths of the ground, reaching even the finest roots. Fortunately, the nature of this tree was extremely mysterious, which was why it could withstand such a terrifying attack. It wasn't like the mountain that Luo Fan had stood on back then, which had completely collapsed and been destroyed. At this moment, a kind of anger was transmitted from the sky. This rage was so intense, so terrifying. It even caused the sky and earth to change color, and all the rules and laws in Luo Fan's field of view to undergo an earth-shattering change. It was as if everything had suddenly turned into ice and was completely frozen. At this moment, Luo Fan's God's Eye could no longer produce any effect on the surrounding rules and laws. Not to mention using the power of his eyes to manipulate the rules and laws to help him resist the attack, it had already become impossible for the divine envoy to move them even a little. At this moment, even his body seemed to have been sealed by the countless rules and laws around him, and it seemed like even his ability to move had disappeared. Anger could actually reach such a level. It could even seal all his movements and cut off all his power. No matter how he thought about it, perhaps only the will of the world possessed such power. Amidst this rage, another beam of light shot down from the sky. This beam of light was several times larger than before, and the laws contained within it were nearly 10 times denser than before. With such a change, the terror brought about by the attack suddenly increased by more than 10 times compared to before. In the face of such an attack, even Luo Fan was not affected by the terrifying rage around him. His body couldn't help but tremble, and he could feel the humiliation of breaking out in a cold sweat. It seems, I can only rely on the shackles. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, his heart trembled and countless lines appeared on his body. These lines were not much different in nature from the lines that filled the world in the outside world. It was just as stable. They were equally powerful. However, the density of these lines was not something the lines in the outside world could compare to. The lines that emerged from his body were so dense that they were like cocoons of light. They completely sealed off the void around him and even cut off his line of sight, making it impossible for him to see anything in the outside world, let alone the terrifying beam of light that descended from the sky. These lines that emerged from his body were not something else. They were the shackles on his body. The God's Eye that he had condensed with the help of the laws had the ability to see through laws. The shackles were essentially a kind of law, but they were completely different from the endless laws in the outside world. Under such circumstances, in his current state of activating the God Eye, this kind of shackle naturally appeared, showing an appearance similar to that of the outside world. No wonder my cultivation was sealed so tightly. It turns out that the shackles are already so powerful. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in his heart when he saw this scene. At this moment, he suddenly understood and felt a little helpless. He even felt a little proud. There seemed to be no reason for that pride, but as long as one understood the principle behind the formation of the shackles, one would naturally understand why he was so proud. It must be known that the shackles were formed from all of his previous cultivation achievements. The stronger and more terrifying the shackles were, the more cultivation achievements he had and the stronger he was. Wasn't this something to be proud of? Just as Luo Fan was sighing in his heart, the beam of light that descended from the sky had already blasted the cocoon of light on his body. In other words, it had blasted the shackles. At this moment, he saw the entire process of his shackles cracking with his own eyes. Starting from the top of his head, countless cracks appeared in a flash. Then, in the blink of an eye, they had penetrated every position around his body and completely enveloped the cocoon of light around his body. Then, through the cracks, he saw what was happening outside the cocoon of light. He also saw the changes that had occurred to the beam of light. The shackles had suffered such a terrifying blow and even had so many cracks, so the force of the recoil was naturally not weak. At this moment, the beam of light had naturally collapsed and turned into countless fragments that began to scatter in all directions. The laws within the beam of light had also been completely shattered and dissipated in the surroundings. However, the beam of light naturally couldn't completely disappear just like that. At this moment, the moment Luo Fan saw through the cracks, the light began to continuously penetrate through the cracks and began to erupt with earth-shattering power, pouring down on Luo Fan's body. If the beam of light was intact, it might have affected Luo Fan a little. But now, the laws within the light had been shattered, and the light itself had mostly collapsed and dissipated. Even though Luo Fan was only a golden immortal, it was a simple matter for him to resist the little bit of light that was left. He focused his mind, clenched his fist, and threw a punch. In the blink of an eye, there was a terrifying force that erupted and rushed up. It completely shattered the strands of light, causing the light that was about to injure him to disappear in an instant. His body, on the other hand, was only shaken a little. He didn't really suffer any harm. On the contrary, because the shackles had so many cracks, he felt an indescribable sense of relief from the bottom of his heart. For a moment, the power in his body flowed, and with a shake of his body, he had already broken through the barrier between the golden immortal realm and the primordial pure yang realm, allowing him to step into the primordial scattered number. For a moment, his strength had suddenly soared more than 1,000 times compared to before. Moreover, this was not the end. His strength was still constantly increasing in the process. Primordial scattered number, primordial true number, primordial gold number, and finally reached the peak of primordial gold number. He was only one step away from breaking through the primordial pure yang realm and stepping into the connate grand luo realm. Just now, he finally ran out of strength and abruptly stopped the improvement. The primordial pure yang realm was a major realm. It was just like the earthly immortal realm before. The earthly immortal realm was divided into 3 realms: itinerant immortal, true immortal, and golden immortal. The primordial pure yang realm was also divided into the primordial scattered number, primordial true number, and primordial gold number. Among them, the difference between each realm was enormous. It was a terrifying difference of thousands or even tens of thousands of times. To rise from the golden immortal realm to the peak of the primordial pure yang realm in one go, the increase in strength was more than 10 million times. If Luo Fan had only made this huge improvement from nothing, he would certainly have exploded from the power in his body, and even the traces of his existence would have been completely erased. But, obviously, he was not that kind of cultivator. This kind of improvement was just a kind of recovery. At this moment, not to mention the impact of the sudden increase in strength in his body, he even felt an indescribable emptiness. He still needed more power to fill up his body, to fill up his strength, to support the improvement of his realm. However, Luo Fan had, after all, broken the shackles and regained his strength. Compared to the time when he was still in the primordial pure Yang realm, there was already a significant difference between him now. The energy within his body and the mysteries that he had grasped were already worlds apart from what he had possessed in the past. Now all his strength, all the mysteries he comprehended and grasped were compatible with this world, or in other words, with this world. In this way, his ability to sense everything in this world was naturally different from what it was normally. Vaguely, he had already caught hold of some incomparably terrifying and vast existence hidden in the fog above. When he looked up, the fog above seemed to have thinned a little, or in fact, he even vaguely felt as if he was resonating with that existence, and he was gradually getting something from that existence. At this moment the fog surged. A rage that was stronger and more terrifying than before was born from the fog. This rage was completely targeted at Luo Fan. After it appeared, it crushed toward him, making him feel like his body was about to be frozen and all his strength was about to be locked. This rage and the inexplicable resonance were so contradictory, but in Luo Fan's perception, they came from the same existence. This made Luo Fan a little confused. All sorts of complicated thoughts flashed through his mind, but his eyes showed a rare blankness. Forget it, I can't figure it out. Let me see what exactly is going on with my own eyes. As this thought flashed through his mind, the power in Luo Fan's body surged, and his figure flashed as he charged upward. Just as his feet left the tree, a rustling sound came from below. Immediately after, the tree collapsed with a loud bang and completely turned into dust. It turned out that the tree had already been completely destroyed by the aftermath of the second attack from the will of the world. The reason it hadn't turned into powder was because Luo Fan was still standing there. His power, willpower, and aura had provided support for the tree. Now that Luo Fan had left this tree, it was equivalent to losing its support, so it naturally collapsed. Without the tree, the brightness of the grassland, which had been shrouded by the floating continent, suddenly dimmed 100 times. The scene, which had originally seemed like daytime, became so dark that one couldn't even see one's own fingers. However, Luo Fan didn't care about all of this at this time. He didn't rush into the sky in a straight line. Instead, he followed the structure of many nomological laws, circled around a mysterious trajectory, and rushed toward the fog. From a normal perspective, Luo Fan's figure suddenly disappeared from this world after leaving the tree, and he couldn't be found anymore. The anger and murderous intent became stronger as he got closer to the fog. At the same time, the feeling of resonance also became stronger as he got closer to the fog. The contradiction between this resonance, anger, and murderous intent formed an inexplicable conflict, which caused the attack that was supposed to arrive from the fog to delay. Although it was troublesome for Luo Fan, he still rushed into the fog unhindered. Inside the fog was naturally boundless fog. When he stepped into it, apart from the lack of the terrifying erosion and destruction, it felt like he had stepped into a state of chaos. Regarding this, Luo Fan, who had once entered the state of chaos as an incarnation, had the most right to say. Fortunately, the inexplicable murderous intent, anger, and resonance did not disappear. Hence, Luo Fan didn't lose his direction, and could continue to advance toward his goal, which was suspected to be the place where the will of heaven and earth was. In this fog, he almost lost his sense of time. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps it was only a few days, or perhaps hundreds of millions of years had passed, Luo Fan suddenly felt that everything in front of him was empty. The boundless fog in his eyes had completely disappeared, and what replaced it was an incomparably mysterious existence. This was a world's will that was 100 times larger than what he had seen before, but it seemed to be inexplicably scattered and even broken. At this moment, above this world's will, there were countless pitch-black electric lights. Chapter 1872. The incomparably deep, incomparably terrifying anger and killing intent that Luo Fan had sensed before came from the silk net formed by pitch-black lightning. The existence that resonated with him existed in the net. It was something that could not be described with words and could not be understood by the will of living beings. It was the will of heaven and earth. No wonder it's so contradictory yet so natural. It turns out that it's produced by two opposing existences. Luo Fan's heart suddenly lit up when he saw everything. The moment he saw the lightning, strands of strange power suddenly surged into his eyes, causing them to explode. In the blink of an eye, they turned into powder and gushed out of his eye sockets like two fountains. The scene was so tragic, so mournful. If someone saw this, they might scream immediately. It can be transmitted just by sight? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. In an instant, he already knew where the terrifying power that poured into his eyes came from. It came directly from the pitch-black lightning. The reason why it appeared was because Luo Fan's gaze had come into contact with the lightning. Its power was directly transmitted through his gaze and poured into his eyes. The transmission of such a terrifying power through such a subtle connection was enough to shock Luo Fan. It should be known that Luo Fan had long been able to transmit power through his gaze. However, the power transmitted through his gaze, compared to the power transmitted through other methods, it was countless times weaker. For example, when Luo Fan was at his peak, transmitting power through sight could only erase a pseudo-saint level being at most, yet now, the pitch-black net had merely relied on that tiny connection of his line of sight to transmit a force that was sufficient to completely obliterate his eyes. So, how could he not be shocked? However, to Luo Fan, since he had already found this place, did this pair of divine eyes exist or not? It was no longer important. At that moment, he didn't care as he slowly walked towards the silk net. Those two empty eye sockets, as he got closer and closer to the pitch-black lightning, the malice and killing intent became stronger and more terrifying. At the same time, the feeling of resonance gradually grew stronger. Faintly, it had even transformed into some sort of indescribable resonance. In a trance, Luo Fan even had an inexplicable feeling, as if he could sense the thoughts of the will of heaven and earth. However, this feeling was so vague. And I can sense it. That kind of thinking was so incomprehensible that Luo Fan even suspected that he was hallucinating. At this moment, the shackles on his body began to creak again. Then, an inexplicable sense of relaxation came from his body, causing the energy around him to surge. In the blink of an eye, he had broken through the bottleneck between the primordial pure Yang realm and the innate grand Luo realm. He had stepped into the innate grand immortal realm. For a time, his strength suddenly rose explosively by who knows how many times. A feeling of being completely isolated from the outside world appeared on his body. Even if it was only the grand immortal Loose Tao, the innate grand immortal realm was already self-sufficient and was no longer restricted by the outside world. He was no longer restricted by the outside world. At this moment, it was as if the shackles on him had completely disappeared. Boundless energy surged out of his body, constantly replenishing his magic power and filling his energy, causing his cultivation realm to rise continuously. In just a few breaths, he had broken through the grand immortal Loose Tao, stepped into the grand immortal True Tao, and charged into the grand immortal Golden Tao. It was only when he reached the peak of the innate grand immortal realm that he felt another shackle again, when he was just a little bit away from the demi-saint realm. There's another shackle? Luo Fan was shocked. The old shackles no longer worked on him when he stepped into the innate grand immortal realm. They could no longer restrict him. It was precisely because of this that he was able to make successive breakthroughs so easily and brazenly break through layers of realms to step into the peak of the innate grand immortal realm. However, this new shackle was something that he had not sensed before. In fact, He could not even control it at this moment. With a slight jolt of his heart, his eyes began to gradually form in his eye sockets. Not long after, he had already condensed a divine eye that was countless times more powerful than before. In that instant, he saw that the layer of shackles around him, which had countless cracks on it, had completely shattered and disappeared without a trace. This caused his body to become empty, and there was no longer any obstruction between him, the black lightning, and the will of the heaven and earth. This was not much different from what he sensed before. However, when he guarded himself internally, he suddenly realized that there was another shackle that he had not noticed before in the depths of his body, or rather, in the depths of his spirit. This shackle began to glow gradually due to his breakthrough into the realm. It gradually appeared and sealed his body, causing him to feel a tighter seal than before. How many more shackles are there? This question flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, it seemed that there was only this layer of shackle in the depths of his divine soul. Previously, he only felt that the shackle only existed on his body, but didn't this layer of shackle appear later on? Who could guarantee that there were no more shackles in the depths of his spirit? When he understood this, Luo Fan frowned. He did not like this feeling at all. This feeling of not being able to control his body perfectly. It was a feeling that he had not felt for many years. This made him feel like he was an ant again, and his fate was once again in the hands of others. At this instant, a wisp of black lightning streaked across the sky and struck him directly. Although he was already at the peak of the innate grand immortal realm. However, in the face of this black lightning, Luo Fan still felt his body's fragility. In an instant, half of his body was minced by the lightning and completely turned into nothingness. At this moment, the will of heaven and earth suddenly began to tremble violently. It seemed that the relaxation of the lightning gave it the strength to struggle. This kind of blow. It woke up Luo Fan from his discomfort. No matter how many shackles there are, I just need to break them. Perhaps I should be grateful for the existence of these shackles, because they can allow me to gain more knowledge and stimulate my view of the world once again. As soon as he thought of this, his mind was completely relaxed. Then, he turned his gaze to the lightning. Another wave of power blasted into his eyes through his line of sight. However, at this time, Luo Fan had already expected it. With a thought, the power was already dispersed with a gentle turn. It blew past him like a cool breeze. Although this kind of power transmitted through the line of sight was powerful, the carrier was still the line of sight. For Luo Fan, he only needed to slightly manipulate the line of sight. Naturally, he would be able to disperse this power. Although I don't know what your respective standpoints are, your attitude towards me is enough to determine who I will help. Luo Fan said lightly. With a thought, the half of his body that had been erased was restored. Then, he opened his hand and faced the black lightning network in front of him. The malice and killing intent that came from the black lightning instantly skyrocketed by many times. It even vaguely materialized, making the originally deep void in the surroundings even deeper and more terrifying. It even vaguely materialized, causing the originally deep and serene void to become even more serene and terrifying. In an instant, wisps of lightning began to gradually emerge from the network, slowly condensing into a strange monster in the void. It looked like a hybrid of a dragon and a tiger, and it directly pounced at Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's divine eyes, which were much more powerful than before, could clearly see that the rules and laws in the monster's body were appearing in a frenzied manner, as if they were exploding. They quickly spread throughout the monster's body, causing the monster's eyes to gradually flicker with a cruel and ruthless light that only living creatures possessed. At this moment, Luo Fan also made his move. On his open palm, an indescribable power suddenly surged out. The power itself was extremely powerful, vaguely possessing a power that surpassed the level of a supreme emperor. However, this was not the full extent of its power. After it appeared, it began to naturally seize all the power around it, all the rules and laws, and all the power. At this moment, the entire world seemed to be drawn in. Endless and terrifying power was emitted from an infinite distance, instantly pouring into the power he released. More and more power was poured in, causing the power to gradually increase, and its appearance to gradually change. In the end, it turned into two palms that transcended time and space. Before the monster could even react, the palms had already locked onto its head and tail. Immediately after, the palms exerted a little force, and the monster completely collapsed. It directly turned into lightning and dissipated in all directions. The entire process was straightforward, as if the monster was just a piece of paper. At this moment, the electric network began to churn. Countless lightning flashed rapidly and condensed, wanting to form another attack. However, it was clearly too late. The two palms of power formed by Luo Fan had already brazenly reached out through the void, directly grabbing onto the electric network. The two palms were extremely huge, and it seemed as if they had almost enveloped the entire electric network, making it seem rather small. The black lightning could even transmit a destructive power that could destroy Luo Fan's eyes just now. Now that they were in direct contact, the connection was more than 10,000 times stronger than sight. The terrifying power that erupted in an instant was naturally earth-shattering. For a moment, the two palms began to deform and collapse under the impact of the boundless power. Countless fragments of power splashed from them, and the scene was unimaginably tragic. However, at this moment, it was not only Luo Fan who was making a move. This world's will. They were also making a move. The two palms received countless support that Luo Fan could and could not sense. Their power became stronger and stronger, and their essence became stronger and stronger. In the midst of the explosion, the black electric network was finally completely torn apart. In the midst of the loud crackling sounds, it was a silk net. It had completely collapsed. At this moment, the entire world began to shake violently. The endless laws and principles seemed to have suddenly relaxed, and an indescribable comfort was emitted from it. The tension that had completely fused with it had completely subsided at this moment. Even the endless flowing light in the light screen that covered the entire world was constantly jumping at this moment, and a strong vitality was being emitted from it. Strands of flowing light constantly descended from the sky. They fell into this world, fusing into the bodies of many creatures that originally existed in this world. After the flowing light fused into each creature, they vaguely experienced some inexplicable changes. It seemed that their intelligence was enhanced, and the confusion in their eyes gradually dissipated. An indescribable joy directly enveloped Luo Fan. In this joy, the shackle that had just appeared on his body began to crack continuously, and vaguely, there were signs of it completely breaking. However, compared to the situation where he could break through the old shackle once there was a crack, now that so many cracks had appeared on the shackle, and it was even on the verge of breaking, he still did not feel the slightest bit relaxed. As for the feeling of breaking through, he did not feel the slightest bit. This clearly showed the difference between the new shackle and the old shackle. However, at this moment, Luo Fan was not in the mood to pay attention to the changes of the shackle on his body. At that moment, he saw the countless scattered black electric arcs rapidly condense, gradually forming a human figure made of black electric arcs. After this human figure appeared, it screamed and rushed out. In a flash, it had already disappeared in front of Luo Fan, disappearing into the fog. Looking at the black figure that was fleeing in panic, Luo Fan could not help but wonder, who is that? Although that figure was only a black lightning, it was extremely powerful. Although Luo Fan did not release his aura at this time, just the sense of existence that he sensed already made Luo Fan feel some kind of indescribable pressure. It could be predicted that this person was definitely not much weaker than when he was at his peak. Only in this way could it give him such an intense pressure at this moment. At this moment, The world's will that had lost its shackle and seal flashed. Immediately after, the black figure that had fled to an unknown place appeared in the fog, and appeared in front of Luo Fan. Countless chains were emitted from the world's will and brazenly wrapped around the black figure, pouring into its body and suppressing it. At this moment, the black figure could only scream miserably. Clearly, it was experiencing endless pain at this moment. Thinking about how powerful the black figure was, one could roughly guess how terrifying the pain that made it scream miserably must be. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could only shake his head and sigh. At this moment, an eye slowly appeared above the world's will. It was an incomparably huge eye that had no emotions, or rather, no emotions that were within the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. After this eye appeared, it did not move at all. It was like a whirlpool that was quietly fixed in place. Just as Luo Fan was secretly amazed, boundless information suddenly appeared in his mind out of thin air. In an instant, an indescribable feeling of fullness spread from his heart, making him feel like he was going to explode from the information in the next moment and directly turn into dust. Fortunately, at this moment, the shackle that had appeared not long ago and looked like it was about to shatter directly appeared and took the impact of the information on his behalf. This prevented him from exploding from the result of the information. However, the shackle did not change at all after taking on so much information. It was still in its half-dead state and did not shatter, nor did it become perfect again. At this point, Luo Fan let out a long breath and focused his attention on the information that almost made him explode. The way the information appeared was so obscure and mysterious that Luo Fan could not even find the way it appeared. It was as if the information had always been hidden in his heart and had just been forgotten. What is this world's will trying to tell me? At this moment, Luo Fan already understood what was going on. There were definitely not many existences that could easily pour information into his heart without him noticing or finding the way. In this world, there was only this world's will in front of him. As the will of this world, the world's will was of a higher level than the will of living beings, and even living beings could not understand it. By doing this, there was probably only one possibility that it wanted to tell this to Luo Fan. After understanding this, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He integrated his mind into the information and began to organize and read the information. Communicating with the world's will is really troublesome. Very soon, Luo Fan could only sigh helplessly. The information that the will of the heavens and earth had poured into his mind was all-encompassing. It contained boundless principles, boundless profundities, and even countless rules of operation. It could almost be considered as an encyclopedia of the heavens and earth. Chapter 1873. Comprehending this information would indeed allow one to obtain endless mysteries of heaven and earth from it. Not only that, it could also stimulate his worldview, allowing him to find a direction to perfect his worldview, a direction to move forward. The benefits could be said to be endless, but that wasn't the main point at all right now, okay? Most importantly, this information was clearly a form of communication between him and the will of heaven and earth. It was equivalent to someone saying a very ordinary sentence to him, or even something as ordinary as a greeting like, "Have you had a meal?" However, he could not understand the main point of this information at all. He could not find out what the will of heaven and earth was trying to express, and he could not understand what it was trying to say at all. The frustration that this brought was self-evident. For the current Luo Fan, being immersed in the mysteries of heaven and earth contained in this information was equivalent to being immersed in the tone of the other party's voice when he heard someone speak, completely ignoring the content of the other party's words. This was obviously unacceptable to him. I originally thought the gap between me and a true sage had narrowed, but I didn't expect that the gap would still be so huge when I actually met one. After a long time, Luo Fan could only sigh to himself. Although he was unwilling to admit the current situation, he could only accept it. The will of heaven and earth had spiritual wisdom and wisdom, but that kind of spiritual wisdom was on a completely different level from a living being. It was a completely different position. To the will of heaven and earth, a living being like Luo Fan was just an ant-like existence. The will of heaven and earth was speaking to him. Conveying its own will to him was equivalent to an ordinary person speaking to a nest of ants and conveying his own will to a nest of ants. To an ordinary person, his words were very clear and without any doubt, and the other party would be able to clearly understand what he was trying to express. However, what would an ant feel like? To an ant, they might only be able to feel the shaking of the ground, the surging of the wind, and the rumbling of thunder in the sky. Obviously, the current Luo Fan was in the position of an ant, and the will of heaven and earth was in the position of an ordinary person. At this moment, the eye above the will of heaven and earth seemed to have some indescribable changes. Then, an endless stream of information poured into his mind. It quickly fused with the information from before. At this moment, Luo Fan once again felt that terrifying feeling of fullness, as if his entire body was going to explode in an instant. At this moment, he did not dare to be careless. He hurriedly used the shackles that had just appeared on his body to take the brunt of the terrifying impact. For a moment, rattling sounds came from the shackles on his body. In the end, he managed to endure the impact with great difficulty, so that his body wouldn't completely collapse under the impact. On the other hand, the shackles didn't seem to have changed much. It was exactly the same as before. At this moment, the eye floating above the will of the heavens and earth gradually disappeared. As it disappeared, Luo Fan felt it in the blink of an eye. The surrounding fog gradually dissipated, and the will of heaven and earth also gradually disappeared. In the blink of an eye, everything around him changed completely. Luo Fan reappeared in the heavens and earth. He looked down at the boundless heavens and earth in front of him and felt what was going on in the heavens and earth. That kind of indescribable change. However, at this moment, he didn't have much time to care about these changes. At this moment, he focused all his attention on the countless information that the will of heaven and earth had poured into his mind. He tried his best to analyze the information, trying to sort out what the will of heaven and earth wanted to express. For Luo Fan, the information contained within was not irreplaceable. The various mysteries and principles of the heavens and earth were not irreplaceable. Even if he lost them, he could obtain them through other means. However, the expression of the will of heaven and earth, or the way of thinking that it revealed, was a window to him. A window to understand the true sage stage, the will of heaven and earth, and the realm that he was pursuing. Under such circumstances, everything else was obviously not important to Luo Fan at this time. As he sank his mind into the endless mysteries, his body gradually gave off an extremely profound aura. He began to fuse with the world around him in an extremely mysterious manner. Gradually, he became a kind of landscape in the world, becoming some kind of law of the world. He gradually melded with it, becoming invisible in the eyes of all living beings, never to be seen again. That aura was the aura of the will of heaven and earth. It was also the most fundamental aura of the heavens and earth. The will of heaven and earth is speaking to me. The content that it wants to express is definitely not hidden in this endless information. Just like when I speak to an ant, the content that I want to say is definitely not hidden in a single vibration. The content that it wants to express is definitely the entirety of the information. That might be some kind of evolution trend or some kind of even grander trend. It might even be the long river of time. There are too many possibilities. Countless thoughts emerged in Luo Fan's mind, but they were quickly annihilated. His state of mind began to continuously rise and rise. From the endless information, it gradually rose. The endless information was like an incomparably vast ocean that enveloped the boundless heavens and earth. As for Luo Fan, he was originally in the depths of that ocean. He could only come into contact with the seawater around his body, but he could not see through the truth of the ocean at all. As his mind continued to rise and leap to a higher level, the truth of the ocean of information that he saw started to increase continuously. It was like when one kept rising from the bottom of the sea, one would be able to see the topography of the seabed more and more clearly. It was as if he had a clearer understanding of the trend of the ocean. During this process, he tried his best to prevent himself from completely immersing himself in the endless principles and mysteries. He tried his best to put his perspective into a macro perspective, tried his best to see through the whole picture of the endless information, and tried his best to advance his mind to a higher level. This kind of thing was extremely difficult. It was almost a behavior that went against the most fundamental instinct of living beings. It was like letting a mouse move through countless food without taking a single drop. Even Luo Fan was constantly suffering in this process. The thought of giving up kept appearing in his heart. However, he still had a strong will after all. He firmly carried out his thoughts and knew what the most important goal he had to pursue was. During this process, he had an incomparably firm attitude. He isolated himself from the endless temptations and carried out his own actions. Time passed. Unknowingly, 1,000,000 years had passed. In these 1,000,000 years, the world had undergone earth-shattering changes. Intelligent living beings that had not been born for an unknown number of years were like bamboo shoots after the rain, being born extremely quickly and densely. Now, 1,000,000 years had passed. An incomparably prosperous cultivation civilization had long been formed in this world. The number of cultivators, from not a single one at the beginning, it had grown to hundreds of billions of cultivators today. In fact, the strongest cultivators had already grown to the pseudo-saint level. Those with exceptional fortuitous encounters were already close to becoming a false sage. In contrast to this, the endless streams of light in the sky had already disappeared. However, they had already disappeared completely. Now, the sky was not even 1/10,000th as bright as before. After thinking about it for a bit, he naturally understood that there were countless intelligent life forms. It was precisely because of these streams of light that they were born. Compared to the earth-shattering changes in this world, there was almost no difference between Luo Fan and 1,000,000 years ago. At least, on the surface, there was no difference. His figure still emitted an aura that only the will of the world existed. It was an aura that almost no living being could sense, and could only affect the world. It made him seem as if he had completely integrated into the world and become a part of it. Due to the existence of this aura, although he did not hide at all in the past 1,000,000 years and just floated in midair without concealment, no living being and no powerhouse in the entire world could see him. Not only that, but even the various natural changes in the world, such as rain, snow, wind, thunder, and earth-shattering, also treated him as if he did not exist and could not affect him. This caused the place where he was floating to seem to have stopped time. What it looked like 1,000,000 years ago was still the same. In other words, even if Luo Fan was an ordinary person with a limited lifespan, if he were to float here, the 1,000,000 years would not leave any traces on his body at all. The place where Luo Fan was hovering was actually the same as the place where he had stepped into the fog back then. In other words, below the floating continent. Due to the special terrain, this place had been developed by countless cultivators over the past 1,000,000 years and had now become a huge city. Of course, the huge city here referred to the floating continent. After all, it was forced by the continent below, and living there would not be too pleasant. Therefore, it only became a place of resources, filled with countless medicinal fields and places to raise countless spiritual beasts. On this day, a strange vibration suddenly came from where Luo Fan was. In the blink of an eye, it had swept across the entire floating continent, and the entire land below it. As the vibration swept across, the two began to tremble violently. This kind of trembling was not the kind of trembling caused by the power of the vibration, but a kind of trembling that seemed to be caused by a change in the mood of an intelligent creature. The vitality in it was obscure, but it was extremely powerful. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly opened his eyes. There was an indescribable light in his eyes. It seemed to be extremely indifferent, but it also seemed to contain endless emotions, containing the deepest feelings of the universe. As for the wisdom contained within, it was so deep that it could not be felt or seen. At this moment, a huge eye suddenly appeared in the void above. It was a huge eye. It looked like a vortex that was floating high up in the void, casting down a massive shadow that shrouded the entire floating continent. However, this kind of shadow was different from ordinary shadows. Ordinary shadows were pitch black, enough to cover everything. But the shadow in front of him had an unparalleled penetrative ability. Under its cover, the floating island seemed to have turned completely transparent, unable to stop any light from passing through, much less obstructing any line of sight. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to have sensed something. He looked up and instantly saw the incomparably huge eye in the sky. A strange and subtle change occurred in the huge eye. A sound that sounded like endless thunder to all living beings in this world instantly reverberated in this area. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes flashed, and some changes also happened. At this moment, the feeling in his eyes was actually somewhat similar to the feeling in the huge eye above. After a while, he opened his mouth, and a loud rumble of thunder reverberated in this world. Following this sound, the huge eye changed slightly. Following that, the eye gradually disappeared amidst a series of loud rumbles of thunder. After a while, it disappeared without a trace. The floating continent also began to gradually recover, regaining its physical appearance, and the normal shadow shrouded the vast land. Luo Fan was still floating in the void, and the light in his eyes did not change much. After a long time, the indescribable expression gradually faded. His eyes regained their normal intelligence. At the same time, his body began to shake, and suddenly exploded, turning into a large cloud of smoke, about to melt into the world. At this moment, a muffled groan was heard. Then, endless power swept across, and the endless smoke began to condense rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had formed his figure. However, compared to before, his face was as pale as paper, and his eyes were full of fatigue. His entire person was simply more miserable than when he had just survived the great calamity. Compared to the misery on his body, his heart was filled with excitement, but also helplessness. Through the previous 1,000,000 years of hard work, he finally raised his state of mind to a sufficient level and finally saw the whole picture of the endless information that the will of heaven and earth had poured into his heart. This, of course, was not what all the information looked like on the surface in the traditional understanding. Instead, it was on an abstract level, using one's own mind to completely contain all the information, treating everything in it as a whole detail, and the whole as a unit to consider a whole picture. If it was not this whole picture, why would he need to spend 1,000,000 years to raise his state of mind to this level? The moment he saw the whole picture, he suddenly understood what the information was trying to express. These were 2 sentences. The first sentence was, "Thou hast done well." The second sentence was, "I can help thee overcome the calamity." These 2 sentences were obviously for the will of heaven and earth. In other words, the meaning of the 2 waves of information that the will of heaven and earth had poured into his heart was expressed. And when he was in this state, he felt that his perspective, his thoughts, his ideas, his everything had changed. Had undergone some kind of indescribable change. The various obstacles in front of him had become so weak at this moment, as if he could destroy them with just a little bit of force. The direction of the path that had made him incomparably confused had become incomparably clear. In fact, in his current state, countless directions that could be perfected appeared out of thin air, and countless areas that needed to be perfected. And the moment he wanted to act according to the feeling brought about by this perspective, he felt an extremely vast and unparalleled existence appear above his head. At this moment, he understood that it was the will of heaven and earth. At this moment, he understood that it was the will of heaven and earth. When he looked up, it was also the moment that the huge eye appeared in the void out of thin air. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, it was an incomparably huge eye, an incomparably huge whirlpool. However, at this moment, in the eyes of Luo Fan, who had changed his perspective, it was a mass of light, a mass of material, all-encompassing, boundless, and supremely powerful light. Congratulations! Remember my promise. These were the two sentences brought about by the two rumbling sounds of the will of heaven and earth. At that time, Luo Fan's reply was, "Thank you for fulfilling my wish." Recalling the various things that had happened in that strange state, Luo Fan finally sighed. Unfortunately, it's ultimately not something that I can have at my current level. Chapter 1874. Luo Fan floated in the void with a startled look on his face. Light flickered rapidly in his eyes, as if there was infinite wisdom flashing in them. Countless thoughts were revealed in his eyes. Although he had already cut off the feeling of being in that strange state, the process was still left in his memory and had truly changed him. At this moment, when he looked at the world again, and looked at all his past cultivation, he felt that there was already a great difference from before. At first glance, it seemed that everything was what it was, and there was no difference from before. However, if he carefully experienced it, he would find that he had become more detached. In the past, many things that he could only think of after dozens of twists and turns could now be clearly seen and understood at a glance. Even many things that had no connection with each other in the past could now be found in an instant. With just this change, Luo Fan had already felt that the infinite power inside his body had faintly changed. It had become purer and more condensed. The direction in which he could exert his power had also become broader. This was the change brought about by the perspective of the world's will. The world's will was a kind of will that was much higher than the will of living beings. This kind of will could even be said to be something that could only be possessed by true saints. Having this kind of perspective was equivalent to having the perspective of a true saint. Although Luo Fan had used his will to completely cut off the feeling of the perspective was still left in his heart. Even if he lost the feeling, he could still rely on this trace to obtain a trace of such a perspective. This was the origin of his current change. I've already seen it for 180 million years? After a slight sensing, he could intuitively feel the benefits that his previous change had brought to him. It was because he sensed that the time for his third calamity had been reduced again. Now, he only needed 180 million years. Such a reduction. It could not be said that it was not small. His heart moved slightly. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already arrived at the highest void and appeared in front of a ray of flowing light. Although he did not carefully sense the infinite information that the world's will had poured into his heart, after obtaining a higher perspective, all of this was no longer a secret to him. At this moment, when he looked at the flowing light, the various mysteries of the flowing light had already appeared in his heart, allowing him to instantly sense it clearly. This flowing light. It was formed by the life essence of the remaining living beings in this world. Every ray of light represented a living being that existed in this world back then. The fundamental reason why they turned into flowing light was very simple. It was because the power that had shattered this piece of heaven and earth had found the will of the heaven and earth the moment the heaven and earth had formed, and then sealed the will of the heaven and earth, replacing the effect of the will of the heaven and earth in another form, completely destroying all intelligent beings in this world. Originally, under the destruction of the black lightning, It was impossible for the countless living beings to have any life essence left. However, it was a pity that the living beings that built the defensive light screen were powerful, and the light screen was mysterious. In the end, it played its role at the last moment and absorbed the life essence of all living beings into the light screen. Not only did it protect them, but it also provided the light screen with a mysterious power, allowing the light screen to protect this world in its chaotic state. It was precisely because the light screen was too mysterious and its power was too terrifying, surpassing the scope of the Black Lightning's power, that the living beings could exist in the light screen forever. It was only when Luo Fan and the World's Will had completely destroyed the lightning that they responded to the World's Will's call and returned to this world. They merged with the living beings that existed in this world, allowing the world to give birth to intelligence again. However, it was a pity that although they might be extremely powerful cultivators, they could not transform their life essence into a unique worldview like Luo Fan. As a result, they would be corroded and damaged at all times. In the state of primal chaos, helping the light screen resist the corrosion of the state of primal chaos had already caused great damage to them, completely erasing all of their memories. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan was no longer able to obtain any scenes related to the formation of this world from their memories. He had no idea what existence had built the light screen or what kind of unbelievable mysteries had been used to build it. Looking at the countless streams of light, Luo Fan felt a strange sense of pity. With a sigh, he grabbed the stream of light and threw it down. The stream of light flew towards a certain place in the world, towards a certain creature that had the strongest compatibility with it. In the end, it poured into that creature and became one with it, giving birth to another intelligent creature in the world. At this moment, Luo Fan could already clearly see the light screen outside the world. Compared to before, the light screen still looked as powerful on the surface, but only Luo Fan knew that after losing so many streams of light to make up for it, the power of the light screen had shrunk by countless times. Back then, Luo Fan had no way to break through it, but now, he could enter and exit it at will at any time. Luo Fan turned his head and glanced at this world. He did not stay in this world for long. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already crashed into the light screen, and in the blink of an eye, he had already left this light screen. With the endless information that the will of the world had poured into his heart, there was no longer a need for him to comprehend the world. He had already obtained everything that he could obtain from here. Back then, under such circumstances, there was naturally no need for him to stay in the world. With a flash of light, Luo Fan's figure had already arrived outside the world. He stood in the passage that he had opened back then and appeared in front of the light screen. At this moment, the light screen did not seem to have changed at all. It was still as dazzling as before. It was still so stable. A smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he recalled what the will of the world had told him. With a single thought, endless power surged out of his body, constantly twisting and condensing in the void. Gradually, an unknown number of mysterious and profound runes were outlined. They were suddenly deeply engraved in the light screen in front of him at this moment. In the blink of an eye, the light on the light screen changed and a mysterious change appeared on it. The countless runes that Luo Fan had poured into it seemed to be rapidly disintegrated by the light. They constantly collapsed and turned into bits and pieces that integrated into the light screen. As the light flowed, the fragments flowed to every corner of the light screen. This process continued continuously. At every moment, the number of runes that Luo Fan had poured into it was in the hundreds of millions. During this process, Luo Fan's expression did not change much. Even his movements did not change. It seemed so natural that people could even see his every move. The contradiction between this action and the result was so strange that it was enough to make anyone vomit blood in frustration. This process lasted for 3 years. On a certain day after 3 years, Luo Fan suddenly stopped what he was doing. As he retracted his hand, the large light curtain in front of him began to emit a buzzing sound. This sound was so mysterious, so strange, as if it was shaking space and time. It shook the nomological laws and caused the incomparably huge chaotic planet to shake violently. The endless nomological laws and nomological laws that were resisting each other on the chaotic planet to maintain a fragile balance started to become chaotic during this process. An indescribable riot was produced. Endless power erupted from this imbalance and directly bombarded the chaotic planet. Under the impact of this terrifying power, the incomparably sturdy and powerful chaotic planet let out creaking sounds. Cracks continuously appeared on the chaotic planet and began to extend inward. Gradually, they traversed the entire chaotic planet, causing the chaotic planet to gradually collapse and turn into powder. Although millions of years had passed, there were still many living beings on this chaotic planet looking for chaos gems. Now that the planet had suddenly undergone such a huge change, it instantly stirred up intense panic among the many living beings. For a moment, no matter what they were doing, they quickly flew up and quickly left the chaotic planet. Unfortunately, although they moved quickly, this change happened too quickly. For a moment, most of the living beings did not have time to leave. During the process of the chaotic planet's collapse, they could not withstand the impact of the power and collapsed one by one. They turned into powder and fell into the same fate as the chaotic planet. All these changes happened extremely quickly. In the blink of an eye, a loud sound came from the incomparably huge chaotic planet. Then, densely packed figures rushed out from it. Next, the entire planet turned into smoke and began to form a vortex that kept spinning. Although the lethality of this terrifying transformation was astonishing, it did not have any power or impact on Luo Fan's body. At this moment, an indescribable light shone from all over his body, faintly resonating with the light screen in front of him. As the terrifying power of the chaotic planet's destruction approached his body, it was naturally offset by the power of the light screen. Although he was in the center of the chaotic planet, he was not affected at all. In fact, he even obtained an indescribable feeling from the endless smoke. At this moment, Luo Fan was not paying attention to the changes on the chaotic planet. At this moment, his attention was on the light screen on the planet in front of him. The light screen constantly emitted a buzzing sound. The entire chaotic planet was shattering amidst this buzzing sound, and the unbalanced laws and laws continuously rushed towards the light screen. As if they were tangible existences, they were constantly absorbed and gradually integrated into the light screen, causing the light screen to vaguely become more and more complex, mysterious, and incomprehensible. In Luo Fan's heart, an indescribable connection gradually appeared between him and the light screen. Or rather, it appeared between him and the world in front of him. This strange change. It lasted for nearly a month before it stopped. And at this moment, all the smoke had completely disappeared. It had been completely absorbed by the light screen and sent into the world. The endless laws and laws that originally existed on the chaotic planet had also been completely absorbed by the light screen, causing the light screen to unknowingly lose its original appearance. It looked like it had already become gray and muddy. It was like a planet without any signs of life. At this moment, Luo Fan was floating in front of the light screen. In other words, he was floating on the gray, moon-like planet. Streams of light flickered around his body, and specks of light decorated his surroundings like the starry sky of the universe. These were not the others. They were the chaos gems that had originally been hidden on the chaotic planet. Although millions of years of digging and searching had passed, the planet was simply too big, and the number of living beings on it was too small. Therefore, even at this time, the number of chaos gems that had been excavated on the chaotic planet was insignificant. Therefore, so many chaos gems had appeared around Luo Fan and been collected by him. Looking at the thousands of specks of light around him, Luo Fan smiled. He casually waved his hand, and the thousands of chaos gems disappeared without a trace. It had already fallen into his sleeve universe, disappearing without a trace. At this moment, numerous gazes locked onto him. Those gazes contained greed, fear, terror, hatred, and so on and so forth. These are the living beings that left the chaotic planet. Luo Fan came to a realization. When he swept his senses over, he discovered that there were hundreds of living beings hidden in the void, and all of them were staring at him covetously. After roughly gauging their strength, he could not be bothered with them anymore. Although there were hundreds of living beings, the strongest among them was only at the Khanate Grand Luo level. Even if they were able to bring forth a might that far surpassed the innate golden immortal realm in this world, it was nothing to him. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The light screen in front of him began to produce an unknown power and gradually rose upwards. As it rose, it gradually became blurry and illusory. In the end, it disappeared without a trace in a very natural manner, as if it had never been there. At the same time, a bright moon appeared in the sky out of nowhere. The bright moon seemed illusory and real at the same time, as if it was only an illusion that was embedded in the sky. Endless moonlight radiated from it continuously, enveloping the entire world. Behind the bright moon was the chaotic state that was surging endlessly. One could vaguely sense an indescribable terror and destruction within it. The brightness of the bright moon combined with the terror and destruction that erupted from the chaotic state, forming an indescribable contrast that produced an indescribable charm. This charm caused the world, which had been extremely dilapidated and seemed like it would collapse in the next moment, to suddenly feel an indescribable sense of peace. Almost all living beings in the world could not help but look at the bright moon in the sky. At this time, the hundreds of creatures hidden in the void around Luo Fan also cast their gazes towards the void, looking at the bright moon that had just been born. "Is this the legendary moon?" Someone said something that sounded like it came from a dream, breaking the peace that had not been seen for a long time. All sorts of noises rang out in the world at this moment. They were all puzzled by the appearance of the bright moon and wanted to find out what changes the appearance of the bright moon would bring. There were even many living beings that flew up from all over the world and headed towards the bright moon. It was a pity that the bright moon seemed to be in the sky, and it seemed like it could be seen from anywhere in the world. However, when living beings truly flew over, they would realize that no matter how far they traveled, what speed they used, or what method they used, they could not get close to the bright moon. Even though they had already arrived at the primal chaos state and were about to come into contact with the primal chaos state, when they raised their heads, the bright moon was still above their heads. It was still emitting the lunar moonlight, and it still brought them endless tranquility, making them feel the comfort of the bright moon. Even if it was a false sage, even if it was a supreme emperor, they could not change this. This made many living beings even more interested in the bright moon, and they wanted to explore the profoundness within it even more. In an instant, the entire world was immersed in the bright moon. More and more living beings came out from their hiding places. Only then did many living beings realize that there were actually so many powerhouses in the world. This was the change of the other living beings in the world. Where Luo Fan was, the situation was completely different. At this moment, the hundreds of living beings hidden in the surroundings all looked at Luo Fan as if they had seen a ghost. They had clearly seen everything that Luo Fan had done. At this moment, they could even clearly see that the bright moon hanging in the sky was almost exactly the same as the planet that had appeared before Luo Fan. Chapter 1875. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. At this moment, their irrational and greedy thoughts had completely disappeared. Although they were greedy and desperately wanted the chaos gems, they were still powerful existences that could cultivate to such a high level in this world. Their intelligence clearly told them that the existence that could create this moon, that could illuminate the entire world and provide endless lunar essence, was definitely not someone they could provoke. Their intelligence told them clearly that the existence who could create this wheel that could illuminate the entire world and provide the world with endless lunar essence was not someone they could afford to offend. At this moment, Luo Fan did not pay attention to them, but more than half of the creatures had already left. The remaining half of the living beings were no longer thinking about snatching the Chaos Gems. Instead, they wanted to establish a relationship with Luo Fan and befriend him. At this moment, Luo Fan did not pay any attention to these living beings. He was currently looking up at the sky and the bright moon that hung in the void. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. The appearance of the bright moon was not his intention. In other words, the appearance of the bright moon was either a characteristic of the world itself or a pure coincidence. Previously, Luo Fan had only done so much for one purpose. That was to leave his mark on the world. This kind of imprint was naturally not enough for him to completely control that part of the world, nor was it enough for him to become the ruler of that part of the world. Luo Fan, who knew these people very well, would not have such an idea. In fact, the reason why he had left his mark on the light screen and in the world was to establish a connection between himself and the world. As for why he wanted to establish a connection, the reason was even simpler. Back then, the world's will had promised him that it could help him survive a calamity. In order for the world's will to truly help him, he naturally needed to summon that power at the right time. Only then could he truly resist the surging calamity. Obviously, in order to summon the power of the world's will, he needed a guide and a connection. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan had established that connection just now. As for the various changes that occurred after that, they were naturally produced because his imprint had sunk into the world. The changes during that period were extremely mysterious. Its profundities were boundlessly profound, and it even contained the will of the heavens and earth. Not only was it the will of the world in that part of the world, but even the will of the broken world where he was now seemed to be involved. It was the interaction between the two. Combined with some sort of indescribable might, it caused that area of the world to undergo such an earth-shattering transformation. It was originally just a world, but it had transformed into a bright moon that hung in the sky. The mysteries of heaven and earth are more profound than I imagined. After thinking about it, Luo Fan could only come to this conclusion. He had no idea where that heaven and earth were right now. How did it work? He turned into a shadow and appeared in the void. He was not sure. Besides that, how could he step into that world again? How could he truly reach the place where that heaven and earth were, and so on and so forth? He had no idea at all. It could be said that apart from the bright moon that seemed to be his subordinate, there was not much difference between what he knew and what the other living beings in this world knew. It was just as little. Under such circumstances, he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. He sighed inwardly. He turned around and looked at the remaining dozens of living beings that had yet to leave. The weakest of these living beings were at the connate grand heavenly realm. The strongest was even at the 9th stage pseudo-sage. They were only one step away from becoming a pseudo-sage. At this moment, existences like them looked at Luo Fan, who was only at the peak of the Golden Path grand heavenly realm. Although their expressions were rather calm, the depths of their eyes were filled with amazement and wariness. "Fellow Taoist, may I know where you come from? Your form is quite special, fellow Taoist." At this moment, a pinnacle faux sage stage being chuckled. This living being had a head and 4 arms. Its body was covered in scales, and it had a green face and sharp fangs. From the perspective of a normal person, it would be extremely ugly. However, this appearance was already considered not bad compared to the various kinds of living beings in the surroundings at this moment. The living beings not far away were the ones that were considered strange. There were caterpillars, strange centipedes, toads, and so on. There was really everything that one could imagine. As long as one dared to think about it, they would definitely be able to find it. The world that I came from is only a perfect world. It doesn't have a name. I call it the Earth Universe. As for my appearance, I don't think it's special. On the contrary, I think that everyone's figures are quite special. Luo Fan only smiled and said, although these living beings had harbored ill intentions towards him previously, that was also human nature. Since they had expressed goodwill, Luo Fuan could not be bothered to be stubborn. As such, he smiled rather amicably. Seeing that Luo Fan did not fall out with him, the living being was overjoyed and said with a smile, Haha, I am Fei Wu. I have been in this broken world for 300 billion years. Everyone here is an old acquaintance, and I have specially come to make friends with you. May I know your name, fellow Taoist? Fei Wu. Luo Fan repeated the name in his heart. He had a vague feeling that it was a little strange. Thus, he did not think too much about it and said, I am Luo Fan. Greetings, fellow Taoist. At this moment, the others finally stopped being spectators. One by one, they came forward and introduced themselves to Luo Fan with smiles on their faces. Not long after, Luo Fan already knew the origins and Tao names of these people. Only an extremely small portion of these living beings were native to this world. They only made up less than 10% of the living beings. The remaining 90% of the living beings were from other worlds. They were either big worlds or perfect worlds. Among them, there were no living beings from the same world. In other words, these living beings alone were enough for Luo Fan to know the existence of dozens of perfect worlds or big worlds. As expected, the chaotic state is countless times livelier than I imagined. Hearing that almost every living being came from a perfect world or big world that was different from the other living beings, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little emotional. In the past, when his perspective had not surpassed the world, he had vaguely felt that there were a considerable number of other perfect worlds or big worlds in the chaotic state. However, he did not feel real after all. Even if he had logically deduced the existence of other perfect worlds, there was still an indescribable loneliness lingering in his heart. He always had a feeling that the perfect world he was in was an extremely rare existence in the chaotic state. Until now, when he came here, he personally saw the many different perfect worlds. There were many living beings in different big worlds. The result of this logical deduction in the past finally felt real. It made him feel the lingering loneliness in his heart gradually dissipate. In the past, he was wary of the chaotic state from the bottom of his heart. He was worried that if he stepped into it, he would be lost forever. Unknowingly, a lot of it had also dissipated. The original intention of those living beings was, of course, to find out how Luo Fan had created that bright moon just now. However, obviously, when their relationship was not deep enough, they would not directly ask questions. Therefore, there were not many key points in their subsequent conversation. They just asked each other about the past. He asked about some cultivation matters and then talked about the various things in this world. In the beginning, those living beings still wanted to build a relationship with him. Then, they began to lead the topic to the bright moon. However, as they chatted, they gradually discovered that this person in front of them had such profound wisdom and understanding of cultivation. Although he did not directly preach the Tao, just a few words that were occasionally revealed in the conversation. This was already an eye-opener for them. Occasionally, there were even some living beings who immediately paused because they comprehended some kind of profoundness. They directly entered a state of breakthrough. For a moment, they gradually forgot their original goal and truly immersed themselves in this kind of conversation. At the same time, they could not help but bring out the various problems that they had encountered in the past to ask Luo Fan for guidance. Regarding these, Luo Fan was not stingy. Apart from his own cultivation foundation, no matter what they asked, he would tell them his understanding without holding back. Of course, this was partly due to his open-mindedness, but it was mostly because they had truly stepped onto their own path of cultivation at this point in their cultivation. Under such circumstances, the principles that they obtained from others could only be used as a reference at most and could only be used to promote their own cultivation. They could not be used directly. Under such circumstances, no matter how much Luo Fan said, No matter how clearly he explained, they would not be able to completely understand his Tao. On the contrary, the clearer he explained, the more important questions they would ask. Through these questions, Luo Fan could feel the profoundness of different Tao, which would naturally stimulate his own worldview and bring him great benefits. There were only benefits and no disadvantages to this kind of behavior, so why not do it? Suddenly, some living beings asked Luo Fan about the strong shackles that the world had on living beings. Luo Fan thought about it and said with a smile, "Speaking of the shackles of the world, I think it should be a self-protection mechanism of the world." This was a new understanding that he had obtained after obtaining the perspective of the world's will for a short while. After obtaining the perspective of the world's will, he could naturally understand the way the world's will thought. Using this way of thinking to bring in the various mechanisms and changes of the world in the current outside world, he could naturally roughly guess what was going on with the strong shackles of the world. These words immediately caused many of the living beings to be filled with shock. They had never thought about it from this aspect. Although Luo Fan had only said one sentence, it was already an eye-opener for them. They felt that the fog that had been covering their minds had suddenly dissipated a lot. There is indeed this possibility. This world has already been shattered because of the battle. If it had a spirit, it would naturally be on guard against powerful creatures. Setting up this type of shackles seems to be only natural. A creature muttered like this. That's right. Luo Fan also felt inexplicably emotional at this moment. The world has a spirit. That was natural. Since the world had a spirit, it would naturally save itself. There were thousands of such self-saving behaviors that set up shackles on living beings. It caused the growth of living beings' strength to slow down and limit their maximum strength, so that the power of living beings could not grow to a level that could threaten the world itself. This was clearly a good choice. As he thought about it, he looked up at the bright moon in the sky and suddenly had an inexplicable realization. Perhaps the bright moon was also born because the world wanted to save itself. The world's will itself had unparalleled power and was almost equivalent to a true divine. If that was the case, if it suddenly saw another world's will, and it was a world's will that shared the same fate as itself, it was extremely likely that the world's will would unite with the world's will. The power between the world's will would connect and flow with each other, forming a stable cycle and balance. In the end, they would stabilize each other and cause the time before they collapse to be greatly delayed. That was what Luo Fan thought about. Soon, he could not help but laugh. This kind of thinking might make sense, but the reality was definitely more complicated than what he had imagined. It was even more mysterious and unbelievable. This was because the various deductions that he was using now were all based on the world's will. Perhaps there were some that slightly involved the world's will, but it was extremely, extremely rare, and the true way of thinking of the world's will. In terms of thinking, even if he had just deduced it, he also knew that there must be a huge difference. However, this was something that could not be helped. For the current Luo Fan, he was only at the level of the world's will. He was only at the level of a living being's will. Even though he had come into contact with the will of the world, it could not change his nature. In that case, to be able to deduce to this stage was already his limit. If he wanted to be more accurate, unless he could truly step into that level, it would only be a fool's dream. At this moment, the many living beings looked at Luo Fan with admiration. Fellow Taoists' understanding of cultivation is truly unfathomable. Just this conversation alone has already given us a lot of benefit. I am willing to build a city for fellow Taoists to live in. Please don't be stingy and stay, one of the living beings said. Hearing this, the other living beings seemed to have woken up from a dream. All of them said, "That's right. We must also contribute to this city. We must make this city the most vast and prosperous city in the world. Only then will we be able to display fellow Taoists' supreme wisdom." At this moment, the other living beings all nodded and continuously expressed how appropriate and necessary this was. For the living beings in this world, even if they were natives, no matter how long this world had existed, they would not have too much of a sense of belonging. Therefore, almost all the living beings in this world did not have the intention to build a civilized country like the other world. In fact, not to mention a civilized country, they could not even be bothered to build a city. Even if there was friendship between living beings, they would only occasionally meet each other. Most of the time, they would spend on their own cultivation and helping themselves break through this world and leave this world. Moreover, this world was so vast and there were so few living beings. This was why this world had become like this. After such a long time, there were only a few cities that had truly appeared. Moreover, they only existed in legends. Under such circumstances, they were willing to build a city and live together because of Luo Fan's existence. This was enough to show that they trusted Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Of course it's not a problem to build a city, but it's not for me. It's for all of us." This clearly meant that he had agreed to it. When everyone heard this, they were overjoyed and immediately voiced their agreement. The living beings here were not ordinary mortals. Every one of them had great abilities and physical strength. Since they had decided on their goal, there would not be any delays. Very soon, they decided on where to build the city. That place was right here, beneath their feet, on the Chaos Planet, which was also where the bright moon had been at this very moment. There was no special terrain here, nor was there any strange scenery. It was just a very ordinary place in this world. In fact, it could even be said to be a rather barren place with a rather harsh environment. Normally speaking, when choosing a city, they should avoid this place. However, it was clear that to the living beings here, these problems were not a problem at all compared to the significance of this place. Very soon, they had determined the scale of this city, and decided to build a floating city. It did not need to be too big, as it only needed to cover the deep crater created by the chaotic planet. Naturally, Luo Fan would not wait at the side with his hands tied. However, he was not surprised by everyone's attitude towards him. He did not participate at all. After discussing with everyone, they designed the city together and perfected it so that it could adapt to the needs of every living being as much as possible. They even left many empty spots for other living beings to come in the future. Although this city had appeared because of them, it was obvious that they would not be the only ones here in the future. It was difficult to satisfy everyone. It was rather difficult to design the city perfectly to satisfy so many requirements. It took 3 days before the design of the city was completed. To be continued. Chapter 1876. Unlike the work of mortals, designing was a much more difficult process for such a powerful cultivator. Therefore, although it took them 3 days to design the city, it only took them a few hours to build the floating city. Several hours later, an incomparably huge floating city that almost completely covered the crater left behind by the Chaos Planet appeared between heaven and earth, right above the crater. Such a city seemed too big for the dozens of living beings there. When they entered it, it was like a drop of water falling into the ocean, and they could not find it no matter how hard they tried. However, all the living beings here knew very well that it would be fine if the city did not appear. Once it appeared, it would definitely become lively in a very short period of time. The huge city in front of them seemed empty, but it would probably be extremely crowded before long. After Luo Fan and the others finished building the city, they respectfully invited Luo Fan to oversee the tallest, most majestic, and most magnificent building in the center of the city. Luo Fan looked at everyone's respectful gazes, and did not act pretentiously. He only smiled and said, "In that case, I won't stand on ceremony." In a flash, he had already stepped into the building. The moment he stepped into it, an endless amount of light shot out from the building. It instantly swept through the entire city and connected every single building in the city. Vaguely, they formed a mysterious and incomparably complicated rune. It produced an indescribable resonance with the laws of heaven and earth. This kind of resonance faintly connected to the bright moon above, causing the bright moon to emit an intense light that rushed down and brazenly poured into the building that Luo Fan had entered, causing the light emitted by the building to suddenly be tinged with a bit of silver, making it appear even more magnificent. It became even more mysterious. This rune was designed by many living beings. It was designed by many creatures. It involved this city's defense and cultivation environment, a type of essential mysteries. However, at this moment, the bright moon in the void suddenly emitted light and poured into the city in front of them. This was no longer the result of their design. In fact, for the many living beings here who did not understand the world and the bright moon, they could not design such a change for the time being. Therefore, all of these changes, in essence, were the natural reaction of the heavens and the earth. It was the bright moon. A natural reaction. In the eyes of the living beings, this was Luo Fan's method. For a moment, Luo Fan seemed even taller and more unfathomable in their eyes. Due to this feeling, they were extremely glad that they had been able to make a prompt decision to build this city. Before they built this city, they had not really decided to live here. At most, they had treated this place as a gathering place. Now, not only had they made up their minds to stay here, but they had also made up their minds to summon more friends and companions to live here. They wanted to develop this place into the foundation of civilization in this world. Luo Fan did not pay attention to the various thoughts in the minds of the living beings. At this moment, he had already fallen into a strange state. Just now, when he stepped into this building, because of the stimulation of his aura and the mysteriousness of the city's design, the mysteriousness hidden inside the city was activated, causing the building to emit light and the mysterious runes in the entire city to appear. Although this gave him some enlightenment, he had participated in the design after all. The final change was also within his expectations, so it could not be considered a great enlightenment. However, the change after this was a little unbelievable to him. The moonlight brazenly broke through all obstructions and directly poured into his body. It directly blasted on the shackles that were on the verge of shattering and even shackled him, preventing him from truly stepping into the sage-to-be realm. The shackles were originally able to withstand countless attacks from the black lightning without budging at all. Even though they seemed to be on the verge of shattering, they did not waver. However, at this moment, facing the seemingly powerless moonlight, they became extremely fragile. In the blink of an eye, the shackles that were on the verge of shattering collapsed with a loud bang and completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. The moment the shackles disappeared, a new layer of shackles was born around his life essence. They gradually spread out and filled his body, causing his body to sink into some kind of shackles once again. They shackled his cultivation realm. However, this shackle was much deeper than the previous shackles. It could no longer stop him from crossing the barrier between the innate Grand Luo realm and the Sage-to-be realm. In the blink of an eye, endless power erupted from Luo Fan's body. His state of mind was extremely elevated. In the blink of an eye, he had already broken through the bottleneck and stepped into a whole new world. He had achieved the Sage-to-be realm that he had already achieved many years ago. Moreover, this achievement did not simply mean that he had just stepped into the Sage-to-be realm. Instead, he had instantly reached the peak of the Sage-to-be realm and was only one step away from becoming a false saint. Of course, perhaps from a broader perspective, he could be considered as only one step away from becoming a true saint after all, regardless of whether it was the Sage-to-be, false saint, despair, supreme emperor, or even the great calamity realm. They were only divided into the innate Grand Luo realm from a broader perspective. The reason why there were so many divisions was because the span of this level was too great. It could be said to be infinite. Therefore, the deeper one understood, the more content they would discover, and the more they would feel that a new realm was needed to define these newly discovered contents. Therefore, it could be said that these realms. In fact, it could be said that it was unnecessary. As long as you have the confidence and the opportunity. It wasn't a fantasy when one could directly advance from the innate grand Luo realm to the true saint realm. Of course, from a certain point of view, this kind of confidence and this kind of opportunity was even more ridiculous than a fantasy. Just as Luo Fan was about to attack the newly appeared shackles, he then discovered the shackles stubbornly blocked his way, preventing him from advancing even a little bit. When he saw this, Luo Fan understood in his heart that he would probably have to wait for the next opportunity. After encountering the shackles once again, he had a vague guess about the situation of his own shackles. These shackles were the result of his past cultivation achievements under the effect of the laws of the world. The number of shackles might correspond to the breakthroughs of the realms he had gone through. The first shackle he encountered was the breakthrough between the mortal realm and the immortal realm. After that, the second shackle. It was the breakthrough between the innate grand Luo realm and the demi-saint realm. The third shackle now was the breakthrough between the demi-saint realm and the false saint realm. By analogy, there might be a fourth shackle between the false saint realm and the false saint realm, and a fifth shackle between the false saint realm and the despair realm. There was a sixth shackle between the despair realm and the Supreme Emperor, and a seventh shackle between the Supreme Emperor and the Great Tribulation realm. When he thought of this, Luo Fan suddenly felt that the road ahead was long again. If it was just an ordinary shackle, not to mention 7, even if there were 70, he wouldn't feel anything even if there were 700. But unfortunately, he couldn't find a way to break through these shackles at all. The previous few shackles, every time he broke through, he seemed to be able to get through them. He did many things but couldn't break through. But suddenly, the shackles were broken without him doing anything. Under such circumstances, he couldn't find a way to break through the next shackle at all. He couldn't even be sure if it was possible to break through the next shackle. There were a total of 5 such shackles left. How could he not feel that the road ahead was long? After a long time, Luo Fan sighed and arrived at the top of the building. When he looked up, the bright moon seemed to be clearer than ever and closer than ever. It was as if he could touch the bright moon if he reached out his hand. After his breakthrough, his perception of heaven and earth had increased by an unknown amount compared to before. At a glance, almost all the laws of the world were vivid in his eyes, and there weren't many that he missed out. In fact, he felt that the closeness between heaven and earth and him seemed to have risen to an unimaginable level. He already had the abilities that a demi-saint would have in the normal world. However, he seemed to have obtained the abilities that a demi-saint could not have, and many abilities that even a false saint could not have. This situation was so strange that Luo Fan was a little stunned for a moment. Perhaps the improvement of my cultivation level and regaining my previous power is one thing, but more importantly, the attitude of heaven and earth toward me has changed. After a while, Luo Fan sighed and vaguely made a guess. Suddenly obtaining an ability that normal people did not have was not his problem, so it was naturally the problem of the outside world. It was obvious that the heavens and earth would only be able to give him more benefits if the heavens and earth thought highly of him. This kind of situation seemed impossible, but after analyzing all the possibilities, there was only one left. In that case, Luo Fan could only think from this perspective. However, previously, the world wanted him to die immediately, but now, it immediately changed to preferential treatment. Such a huge contrast was really hard for him to accept for a while. At the top of this building was a platform. This was not only a place to sit and observe the stars, but also a place to preach the Tao. It was also the hub of the entire city. As long as one sat here, they could control the entire city. This was the original design. But now, Luo Fan vaguely felt that the world seemed to have given this place authority that he still could not understand, making this place even more wonderful and important than the original design. With a thought, Luo Fan slowly stretched out his hand to touch the bright moon that he felt. In an instant, a strange feeling came from his hand. He really felt as if he had touched the bright moon. At this moment, the trace of a huge palm suddenly appeared on the bright moon in the void. It was as if an invisible hand had suddenly grabbed the bright moon. This was so sudden. Such a strange change made all the living beings in this world, who could observe the trace of the palm, speechless. Immediately afterward, an inexplicable panic began to linger among all living beings. They could not even get close to the bright moon, but now there was a powerful existence that could use a method that they could not understand to directly grab the bright moon. Didn't this mean that there was an existence that could use a method that they could not understand to pass through time and space and directly erase them? This panic made the atmosphere of this world much more solemn and tense regarding this change. Luo Fan also felt that it was extremely sudden. He raised his hand and gently stroked the bright moon. The bright moon seemed to be turned by him, and it began to slowly spin. And this caused even more intense tension and panic in this world. Luo Fan quickly came to a realization. An indescribable understanding appeared on his face. So that's how it is. No wonder it caused such a change. So it's because I left a mark on the bright moon. At this moment, a certain doubt that he had before. He already had an answer. Why did Ming Yu interfere when he was activating the city? The fundamental reason was the resonance of the mark. This resonance appeared between the bright moon and the city. In an instant, it caused the bright moon to emit a strong lunar essence, pouring into the center of the resonance. In other words, it came from the building he was in, and then through the building it was transmitted to the entire city. Then, the city also underwent a subtle change. As for the change on the platform, as for how his shackles were broken, he could not figure it out. But thinking about it, it should be related to the bright moon and the mark that he had integrated into it. In the end, the level is still a little low. After a long while, Luo Fan sighed and finally let go, no longer stroking the bright moon. However, at this moment, the bright moon did not stop spinning even though it had lost his touch. Instead, it continued to spin slowly in the void like before, steadily emitting endless lunar essence, revealing to the entire world the result of what had happened. There were big and small creatures that built the city. The big ones were like hills, while the small ones were the size of fists. At this moment, Luo Fan was at the top of the building. Compared to the crowd, he did not stand out at all. They looked at Luo Fan, but there was not much difference compared to when they were floating in the void. All the things that Luo Fan had done before, the creatures in other places did not know because they were far away. But they saw everything with their own eyes. At this moment, the shock from before still lingered in their hearts. No one knew when, but all the creatures bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Greetings, Lord of Mou City." At first, this voice only reverberated in the city, but gradually, it seemed to have caused some kind of resonance. With the help of the rules of heaven and earth, it began to spread to all parts of the world. Gradually, it seemed like the whole world was cheering and roaring. An indescribable atmosphere gradually arose. More and more creatures were attracted by the atmosphere and cast their gazes in the direction of the crowd. Then, many creatures from all over the world began to rush towards this city. Their expressions were filled with inexplicable hesitation, inexplicable anticipation, and inexplicable excitement. All of them could faintly sense that some sort of huge change was about to occur in this world. This change would probably completely change the entire world, and even their fates. The creatures that could survive in this broken world and sense the change in the city were definitely not weak. Perhaps they couldn't see the world as thoroughly as Luo Fan, but what they saw wasn't something that ordinary living beings could compare to. Even if they couldn't see the changes in the world clearly, the instincts in their hearts would still warn them. If it was just one or two creatures, they might not be able to be sure. However, as they met more and more companions, their instincts were confirmed, and they became more and more certain of their instincts. The hesitation in their eyes gradually disappeared, and only an inexplicable anticipation and excitement remained. Under this situation, the number of creatures in the city that Luo Fan and the others built kept increasing. There were only a few dozen at first, but not long after, there were hundreds. Not long after, there were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. In just a few short days, the previously empty city was densely packed with living beings. Many of the large living beings even had to shrink their bodies in order to have enough space to accommodate the increasing number of living beings. Even so, there were still streaks of light coming from all directions. Living beings were rushing toward the city using their own method. At a glance, the void was filled with rainbow-colored lights, and the quiet rooms whistled. Over the past few days, Luo Fan just sat on the platform in a daze. His eyes and face did not move at all, as if he was a statue. He seemed to see everything that was happening in the world and the city, but he did not seem to care at all.